In the misty fjords of medieval Scandinavia, between the years 793 and 1066, a remarkable chapter of human history quietly unfolded. It began on a summer morning in June of 793, when Norse longships first appeared on the horizon near Lindisfarne, a small monastery off the coast of northern England. These weren't just random raids by seafaring warriors, they marked the beginning of what we now call the Viking Age, a transformative period that would reshape the entire medieval world, from the dense forests of Norway to the windswept coasts of Denmark and Sweden. Communities of farmers, craftsmen, and traders gradually became some of history's most skilled navigators. They carved their names not only through conquest, but through an extraordinary web of exploration that stretched from the icy shores of Greenland to the golden markets of Constantinople. The Viking Age represents something profound about the human spirit, our endless curiosity to discover what lies beyond the horizon, and our ability to adapt and thrive in the most distant corners of the world. Tonight, we'll explore how these northern peoples didn't just raid and pillage, but built trade networks, established cities, and left an indelible mark on the cultures they encountered, creating a legacy that still echoes through our modern world. Picture Norway in the year 600, massive fjords cut deep into the coastline like giant fingers. These weren't just pretty landscapes, they were natural harbours that could hide entire fleets. The water stayed calm even when storms raged outside, perfect for testing new ship designs. Every Norwegian community lived within sight of the sea. Children learned to swim before they could properly walk. Boys built their first boats from driftwood and seal skin. Girls wove the strongest sails from wool and linen. The ocean wasn't something to fear. It was the highway that connected every village. Sweden told a different story. Endless forests stretched north toward the Arctic Circle. Pine and birch trees grew tall and straight, perfect for ship masts. The wood was so strong that Swedish shipbuilders became famous across northern Europe. But Sweden offered something even more valuable, iron ore. Deep in the Swedish wilderness, communities like Gamla Uppsala had learned to extract iron from bog deposits. Not just crude metal, high-quality steel that could hold the sharpest edge. Archaeological digs at Gamla Uppsala reveal something remarkable. These weren't primitive villages. They were sophisticated manufacturing centres. Excavations have uncovered elaborate workshops filled with precision tools, scales for weighing silver, moulds for casting bronze jewellery, evidence of long-distance trade networks that stretched from the Arctic Ocean to the Baltic Sea. The people living here around 700 weren't struggling farmers. They were skilled metalworkers and traders. Denmark provided the final piece, rich farmland that could feed larger populations, gentle coastlines perfect for harbours, and something crucial that Sweden and Norway lacked, easy access to the rest of Europe. The Danish trading town of Hedeby shows how advanced these societies had become. Founded around 700, Hedeby wasn't a rough frontier settlement. It was a planned city. Streets laid out in careful grids, houses built to standardized measurements, public wells providing clean water. The archaeological evidence from Hedeby tells an incredible story. Merchants from across northern Europe came here to trade. Arabic coins from Baghdad, Byzantine silk from Constantinople, amber from the Baltic, walrus ivory from Greenland, all changing hands in Hedeby's marketplace. These weren't isolated barbarian tribes. They were part of a sophisticated trade network that connected the Arctic to the Mediterranean. Long before the first Viking raids, Scandinavian merchants were already travelling vast distances. But what really made the Vikings unique wasn't just their geography, it was their social structure. Most medieval European societies were rigid hierarchies, kings at the top, peasants at the bottom. Everyone knew their place and stayed there. Scandinavia worked differently. Their society was built around the Thing, a local assembly where free men could speak their minds and vote on important decisions. Archaeological evidence shows that even small Scandinavian communities had formal meeting places, stone circles where the Thing gathered. These weren't just talking sessions. They made real decisions about law, trade and war. This tradition of democratic participation created something unique, a culture that valued individual initiative and collective responsibility. The Thing system also explains why Viking expeditions were so successful. When a ship captain proposed a risky voyage, he couldn't just order men to follow, he had to convince them, present his case, answer questions, win their agreement. This meant that only the best-planned expeditions actually set sail. The religious beliefs of these early Scandinavians also shaped their character. They worshipped gods who were warriors and travellers. Odin traded his eye for wisdom. Thor journeyed to the edge of the world to fight giants. These weren't distant, untouchable deities. They were examples of how brave individuals could achieve great things through courage and cleverness. The archaeological record shows that Scandinavian religious practices emphasized personal bravery and honor. Burial sites contain weapons, ships, and travel goods. The message was clear. The afterlife was a continuation of the adventures that made life worth living. But around 750, something began to change. Something that would push these skilled seafarers beyond their traditional boundaries. Climate data from ice cores and tree rings tells the story. The medieval warm period was ending. Temperatures across northern Europe started dropping. Growing seasons became shorter and less predictable. Crop yields decreased just as populations were reaching new highs. The change hit Scandinavia particularly hard. Communities that had thrived for generations suddenly found themselves facing food shortages. The archaeological record from this period shows clear signs of stress. Fewer luxury goods in graves, smaller houses, evidence of malnutrition in skeletal remains. Traditional responses to food shortages weren't working anymore. In earlier centuries, Scandinavian communities had simply expanded into unused land. But by 750, all the good farmland was already taken. The climate was getting worse, not better, and population pressure kept increasing. Some communities tried intensifying their agriculture. Archaeological evidence shows desperate attempts to farm marginal land that had never been cultivated before. Terraces carved into steep hillsides, drainage systems in boggy areas. Most of these experiments failed. Others turned to their traditional skills in metalworking and trading. But even the most successful craftsmen couldn't eat iron tools or amber jewellery. They needed access to agricultural surplus from somewhere else, and that surplus was becoming harder to find as the climate crisis spread across northern Europe. This is where Scandinavian shipbuilding technology became crucial. While other cultures were struggling with overland transport of heavy goods, the Norse had perfected vessels that could carry substantial cargo across water. Their longships weren't just warships. They were the medieval equivalent of cargo planes. A single longship could carry as much grain as 100 pack horses, and do it faster, cheaper, and more reliably. Suddenly, communities facing food shortages had a potential solution. Load up their best ships and go find agricultural surplus somewhere else. The problem was that all of northern Europe was experiencing the same climate crisis. Danish farmers were having the same problems as Norwegian farmers. Swedish communities were just as desperate as their neighbours. The traditional trading networks that had sustained Scandinavian commerce for centuries were breaking down. This forced a crucial decision: stay home and hope the climate improved, or use their superior ships and navigation skills to look for opportunities beyond the traditional trading zone, beyond the known world. Some chose to stay. Archaeological evidence shows that many Scandinavian communities simply contracted during this period. Fewer people, smaller settlements, reduced ambitions. They survived the crisis by lowering their expectations. But others chose differently. The most skilled ship captains began looking at their maps and wondering what lay beyond the edges. What kinds of wealth might exist in lands that no Scandinavian trader had ever visited? Places where the climate crisis might not have hit as hard. This wasn't reckless adventure-seeking. It was careful calculation by people who understood both the risks and the potential rewards of long-distance maritime travel. They had the ships, they had the skills, and they had increasingly desperate reasons to use both. The stage was set for something unprecedented. Not just raiding or trading, but systematic exploration of whatever lay beyond the horizon. The land that had made the Vikings was about to send them far from home. The first expedition beyond the horizon happened sooner than anyone expected. Summer of 793 brought another bad harvest to western Norway. A group of farmers from the fjords around present-day Bergen faced a simple choice: watch their families starve over the coming winter, or load their best longship and try something desperate. These weren't professional warriors. Archaeological evidence from similar Norwegian communities shows they were skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths who could forge the finest tools, shipwrights who understood every detail of maritime construction, farmers who knew how to read weather patterns and ocean currents, but they were also desperate. Their leader was probably a local chieftain named something like Ragnar or Olaf. We don't know his actual name. The monks who survived never bothered to ask. But we know he was experienced enough to navigate the North Sea and smart enough to pick his target carefully. They had heard rumours about Christian monasteries from Danish traders, buildings filled with gold and silver, defended by men who had taken vows never to fight, located on islands that could be approached from the sea without warning. The target they chose was perfect. Lindisfarne sat 2 miles off the Northumberland coast, connected to mainland England only by a narrow causeway that disappeared at high tide. The monastery was famous across Europe for its wealth and learning, but it had no walls, no guards, no military defences of any kind. The voyage from Norway took about 4 days in good weather. The Norwegian raiders probably left their home fjord in early June, timing their arrival to coincide with the summer's longest days. More daylight meant better navigation and a higher chance of success. On the morning of June 8th, Brother Higbald woke before dawn as usual. He had served as the monastery's bell ringer for 15 years. The routine never changed: ring the bell at sunrise, call the brothers to morning prayers, begin another peaceful day in service to God. Lindisfarne had been peaceful for 2 centuries. Founded in 635 by Irish monks, it had become one of medieval Europe's most important centres of learning. The monastery's library contained hundreds of hand-copied manuscripts. Its treasury held gold crucifixes, silver chalices, and jewelled reliquaries that pilgrims had donated over generations. The monks lived simple lives focused on prayer, study, and manual labour. Brother Ethelred spent his days copying manuscripts in the scriptorium. His illuminated pages would later become the famous Lindisfarne Gospels, one of medieval art's greatest masterpieces. Brother Eckred tended the monastery's gardens, growing herbs and vegetables that sustained the community through long northern winters. None of them had ever seen a Viking longship. The Norse vessels appeared on the eastern horizon just after sunrise, low and sleek, designed to slice through ocean swells with minimal resistance. The dragonhead prows weren't just decoration. They were psychological weapons meant to strike fear into anyone who saw them approaching. At first, the monks probably mistook them for merchant ships. Traders occasionally visited Lindisfarne to sell goods or seek the monastery's blessing for long voyages. The island's location made it a natural stopping point for vessels travelling along England's northeast coast. But as the ships drew closer, details became visible that no monk had ever seen before. Round shields lined the gunwales. Armed men stood at the bow. These weren't peaceful merchants. The attack began without warning or negotiation. The Norwegian raiders hit the beach at high tide when the causeway to the mainland was completely submerged. No escape route existed except by sea, and the monks had no boats capable of outrunning Viking longships. What happened next shocked medieval Europe to its core, not just because of the violence, but because of what the violence revealed about the world they thought they knew. The raiders moved through the monastery with ruthless efficiency. They knew exactly what they were looking for: gold and silver objects that could be easily transported, precious stones that could be pried from religious artifacts, anything valuable and portable. The monks offered no resistance. Their religious vows forbade violence even in self-defense. Some tried to hide the monastery's most precious relics. Others attempted to flee toward the mainland, not realizing the causeway was underwater. Most were killed quickly. A few were taken as slaves to be sold in Scandinavian markets. The survivors who managed to hide until the raiders left would later provide the only eyewitness accounts of what happened. The actual raid lasted less than 6 hours, but its impact would echo across centuries. The psychological shock was immediate and devastating. For 200 years, Christian Europeans had believed that monasteries were untouchable, sacred ground protected by divine power. The idea that pagans would dare attack such places was literally unthinkable. Brother Higbald, if he survived, would have watched his peaceful world disappear in a single morning. The bell he had rung faithfully for 15 years now called out over burning buildings and scattered manuscripts. Everything that had seemed permanent and protected was suddenly gone. But the raiders were probably just as shocked by their success. They had expected some kind of resistance. Medieval Scandinavian society was built around warrior culture. Everyone knew how to fight. The idea that an entire community would be completely defenseless was as foreign to them as their attack was to the monks. The ease of their victory changed everything they thought they knew about the world beyond Scandinavia. News of the attack spread across medieval Europe with unprecedented speed. This wasn't just local violence, it was an assault on the entire Christian worldview. Monasteries from Ireland to Italy began writing anxious letters to each other, trying to understand what had happened and what it might mean. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recorded the event with obvious terror. In this year, dire portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. They consisted of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. The chronicler was trying to make sense of something that didn't fit his understanding of how the world worked. Surely such an unprecedented disaster must have been preceded by supernatural warnings. Regular human beings couldn't have caused such devastation to holy ground. Alcuin of York, one of medieval Europe's greatest scholars, wrote a letter that captured the horror felt across Christian Europe. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. Nor was it thought that such an inroad from the sea could be made. That last phrase was crucial. Such an inroad from the sea could be made. Medieval Europeans had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that serious attacks came overland. Armies marched. Siege engines rolled on wheels. Naval warfare meant coastal battles between similar cultures with similar ships. The idea that foreign raiders could cross hundreds of miles of open ocean, strike without warning, and disappear back to sea was revolutionary. It made every coastal monastery, every trading town, every harbour settlement suddenly vulnerable in ways no one had previously imagined. The Lindisfarne raid proved that the North Sea wasn't a protective barrier. It was a highway that skilled navigators could use to reach any point along Europe's coastline faster than any land-based army could respond. This realization spread panic far from Northumbria. Coastal communities across Britain and Ireland began sending frantic messages to their rulers, begging for protection against attacks that might come without warning from the sea. But the real impact went deeper than immediate fear. The success at Lindisfarne demonstrated something that would reshape medieval Europe. The Christian world's wealth was completely unprotected against seaborne assault. Centuries of accumulated treasure sat in monasteries and trading towns that had never been designed to withstand military attack. For desperate Scandinavian communities facing climate-driven food shortages, this was transformative news. The world beyond their traditional borders wasn't just rich, it was defenseless, and their superior ships and navigation skills gave them advantages that no other culture could match. The Norwegian raiders who attacked Lindisfarne returned home with more wealth than their community had seen in generations. Gold and silver that could buy grain to last through multiple winters. Proof that the rumours about Christian monastery wealth were actually understatements. More importantly, they brought back detailed intelligence about European coastal defences, or rather the complete lack of European coastal defences. Every harbour they had seen was unfortified, every monastery was unguarded, every trading town relied on isolation for protection rather than walls or weapons. Word spread quickly through Scandinavian communities. The sea routes to unprecedented wealth were open. The skills they had developed for local coastal trading could be adapted for long-range raiding. and the climate crisis that had made traditional life unsustainable had accidentally revealed opportunities that no previous generation had imagined. This wasn't just the beginning of Viking raiding. It was the moment when medieval Europe discovered it was part of a much larger world than anyone had realized. A world where distant strangers could appear without warning, and where the boundaries between different peoples were about to become much more fluid. The morning that had started with Brother Higbald's peaceful bell would end with the birth of the first truly global age. The success at Lindisfarne created an immediate problem. Every Scandinavian community wanted ships capable of crossing the North Sea. But building a proper longship wasn't something you could figure out overnight. The Norwegian raiders had used vessels perfected over centuries of coastal navigation. Ships that looked simple but contained revolutionary engineering solutions that most of the world had never seen. To understand how the Vikings conquered the seas, you need to watch a longship being built. Picture a Norwegian shipyard around 820, located in a sheltered fjord where the water stays calm even during winter storms. The master shipwright has been chosen carefully. He learned his craft from his father, who learned from his grandfather. This knowledge passes down through families like a closely guarded secret. The work begins in late autumn when the trees have stopped growing. The shipwright walks through old-growth forests looking for specific specimens. Not just any oak will do. He needs trees that grew slowly in harsh conditions, wood with tight grain that won't split under stress. Each tree gets examined like a piece of art. The trunk must be perfectly straight for at least 60 feet. No major branches below that height, no signs of rot or insect damage. The shipwright can tell from the bark pattern whether the wood inside will be strong enough for ocean voyaging. Finding the right trees takes weeks. A single longship requires timber from dozens of carefully selected specimens. The keel alone needs a tree trunk nearly 90 feet long without a single flaw. Such trees are rare even in Norway's endless forests. The actual construction reveals engineering genius that wouldn't be matched by other cultures for centuries. The keel gets laid first. This isn't just the backbone of the ship. It's a flexible spine that allows the entire vessel to bend with ocean swells instead of fighting them. Most shipbuilders of the time built rigid hulls that cracked under wave pressure. The Vikings understood that flexibility meant survival. The hull planks get attached using a technique called clinker building. Each plank overlaps the one below it, creating a surface that sheds water naturally. The planks aren't held together with nails alone. They're bound with iron rivets and sealed with tar-soaked rope. This creates a hull that's both waterproof and flexible. But the real innovation is in the proportions. A longship is 7 times longer than it is wide. This makes it incredibly fast through the water, but also means it can navigate rivers and streams that would stop larger vessels. The shallow draft means a fully loaded longship draws less than 3 feet of water. This combination of speed, flexibility and shallow draft gave Vikings capabilities that no other maritime culture possessed. They could cross open oceans, then sail up rivers deep into enemy territory, attack from directions that seemed impossible, disappear into waterways too shallow for pursuit. The construction process takes 6 months with a crew of 20 skilled craftsmen. Every joint gets tested multiple times. Every plank gets shaped by hand to fit perfectly with its neighbours. There are no standardized parts. Each longship is a unique creation adjusted for its intended purpose. The shipwright makes dozens of crucial decisions that affect the vessel's performance. Steeper sides for ocean crossing, shallower draft for river navigation, reinforced bow for beach landings. Each choice involves trade-offs that require deep understanding of maritime physics. The finished product looks deceptively simple. A sleek wooden hull with a single square sail and space for 30 oars. No complex rigging, no multiple masts, just clean lines and perfect proportions. But this simplicity hides revolutionary capabilities. The archaeological evidence comes from ships like the Gokstad vessel, discovered in a Norwegian burial mound in 1880. Perfectly preserved in blue clay, it revealed construction techniques that amazed modern naval architects. The hull was made from 16 different types of wood, each chosen for specific structural properties. The Gokstad ship was built around 890 for a wealthy chieftain's burial, but it wasn't just a ceremonial vessel. Where patterns on the oars show it had been used extensively for ocean voyaging, this was a working ship that had crossed the North Sea multiple times before being placed in the burial mound. Modern testing of Gokstad replicas proved what the original builders knew intuitively. These ships could maintain speeds of over 10 knots in good conditions. That made them faster than most naval vessels of the time, and they could do it while carrying substantial cargo or raiding parties. The Osberg ship, discovered in 1904, revealed even more sophisticated techniques. Built around 820, it featured decorative carvings that would have taken master craftsmen months to complete. This wasn't just functional shipbuilding, it was maritime art of the highest quality. But beautiful ships were useless without the ability to navigate them across featureless oceans. This is where Viking innovation became truly remarkable. They developed navigation techniques that wouldn't be matched by other cultures until the invention of modern instruments. The foundation was careful observation of natural phenomena. Viking navigators learned to read wave patterns reflected off distant islands. Even when land was below the horizon, experienced sailors could detect its presence from subtle changes in wave behavior. Cloud formations provided another navigation tool. Islands and coastlines create distinctive cloud patterns that skilled observers can recognize from dozens of miles away. Vikings learned to identify specific landmarks by the clouds that formed above them. Bird behavior offered crucial directional information. Different seabird species flew specific distances from land. Vikings knew that gannets didn't venture more than 50 miles from their nesting sites. Ravens stayed within sight of shore. Following the right birds could lead ships safely to land even in thick fog. The most sophisticated technique involved sun navigation using crystal compasses. Archaeological finds include pieces of Iceland spar, a type of crystal that maintains polarization properties even on cloudy days. Viking navigators could use these crystals to locate the sun's position when it wasn't visible directly. This technique works because sunlight becomes polarized as it passes through clouds. The Iceland spar crystal reveals the direction of polarization, which points toward the sun even in complete overcast. Modern testing has proven this method accurate enough for ocean navigation. Vikings also developed techniques for nighttime navigation using star positions. But their most remarkable achievement was navigating during the polar summer, when the sun never sets but constantly changes position. They learned to track solar movement patterns that allowed precise navigation even when traditional day-night cycles disappeared. These skills were passed down through generations of master navigators. Each experienced captain trained a handful of apprentices in techniques that took decades to master fully. The knowledge was considered so valuable that some families guarded specific navigation secrets for centuries. The combination of superior ships and navigation skills gave Vikings unprecedented mobility. They could appear anywhere along Europe's coastline with little warning, strike quickly, then disappear into ocean vastness before local forces could respond. But the ships weren't just for raiding. The same vessels that carried warriors to Lindisfarne could transport families to new settlements. Cargo holds designed for stolen treasure could carry trade goods, livestock, or farming tools. The longship was simultaneously a warship, transport vessel, and exploration platform. This versatility became crucial as Viking ambitions expanded beyond simple raiding. Successful attacks required detailed intelligence about target locations, defense patterns, escape routes, seasonal patterns of wealth accumulation. This information could only be gathered through careful reconnaissance missions that looked like peaceful trading expeditions. Viking merchants began appearing in markets across northern Europe decades before the major raids began. They studied coastal defenses, mapped river systems, and identified the most lucrative targets. When the raids finally came, they were planned with precision that reflected years of careful preparation. The ships also enabled rapid communication across vast distances. A message could travel from Norway to Ireland faster by longship than by any overland route. This allowed coordinated attacks involving multiple raiding parties from different Scandinavian regions. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking shipbuilding techniques spread rapidly through Scandinavian communities during the early 9th century. Every major settlement wanted vessels capable of long-range voyaging. Local variants developed to suit specific regional needs. Danish shipbuilders focused on vessels optimized for river navigation. Norwegian yards specialized in ocean crossing capability. Swedish craftsmen developed ships designed for the shallow waters and narrow passages of the Baltic Sea region, but all shared the same fundamental innovations: flexible construction that could handle severe weather, shallow draft that opened up waterways inaccessible to other vessels, speed and maneuverability that made escape always possible. The psychological impact of these ships was almost as important as their technical capabilities. The dragonhead prows weren't just decoration. They were terror weapons designed to demoralize enemies before battle even began. Combined with the ship's ability to appear without warning, this created fear that often proved more effective than actual combat. Coastal communities across Europe began reporting dragon ships in their nightmares years before they ever saw real Viking vessels. The mere possibility of attack from the sea created anxiety that disrupted normal life and commerce. This fear was justified. By 820, Scandinavian shipyards were producing longships faster than ever before. Each successful raid provided wealth that funded construction of even more vessels. The cycle fed on itself, creating a maritime revolution that would reshape medieval Europe. The ships that had carried desperate farmers to Lindisfarne were becoming the foundation of the first truly global culture. Vessels capable of reaching any coastline in the known world, and some that weren't known yet. Vikings were about to discover that their revolutionary ships could take them much further than anyone had ever imagined. The horizons that had once seemed like the edge of the world were actually doorways to continents that European maps didn't even show. By 820, Viking shipyards across Scandinavia were launching vessels faster than anyone could count. Each successful raid brought back wealth that funded even more expeditions. But something interesting began happening. Different regions started choosing different targets. The pattern wasn't random. Geography and opportunity shaped where each group decided to sail. Norwegian Vikings looked west. Their fjords faced the North Sea and the Atlantic beyond. From their coastal settlements, Ireland and Scotland lay just a few days sailing in good weather. These western routes also offered something crucial: islands that could serve as stepping stones for longer voyages. The Norwegian expansion began cautiously. Small raiding parties tested Irish defences throughout the 820s. They discovered that Ireland was even more vulnerable than England had been. The island was divided into dozens of competing kingdoms that rarely cooperated against outside threats. Irish monasteries contained wealth that made Lindisfarne look modest. Centres like Clonmacnoise and Glendalough had accumulated centuries of donations from across Celtic Europe. Gold, silver, precious manuscripts, and religious artifacts filled treasuries that had never been designed to withstand military assault. But the Norwegians quickly realized that simple hit-and-run raids were limiting their potential. Ireland's location made it perfect as a permanent base for further exploration, an island stronghold from which they could launch expeditions in any direction. In 841, Norwegian Vikings established their first permanent settlement at Dublin. This wasn't just a raiding camp, it was a planned city designed to serve as the headquarters for Scandinavian expansion throughout the Celtic world. The choice of location was brilliant. Dublin sat at the mouth of the River Liffey, giving longships easy access to Ireland's interior. The harbour could shelter entire fleets during winter storms. And the surrounding countryside was fertile enough to support a growing population of settlers. Archaeological excavations in modern Dublin reveal the sophistication of this early Viking city. Streets laid out in organised patterns, workshops for metalworking, leathercraft and ship repair, warehouses for storing goods from across the known world. This was urban planning on a scale that most of medieval Europe couldn't match. Dublin became the launching point for Norwegian expeditions to Scotland, Wales and eventually Iceland. By 850, Norwegian Vikings controlled most of Ireland's coastline and were pushing inland along the major rivers. But they encountered something unexpected. Irish resistance that proved much more effective than anyone had anticipated. The Irish had learned from early Viking successes. Local kings began cooperating against the common threat. They built new fortifications designed specifically to resist seaborne assault. Most importantly, they started adopting Viking tactics and technology for their own use. By 860, Irish forces were using captured longships to launch their own raids against Viking settlements. They had learned that the best defence against Viking mobility was matching it with their own naval capabilities. This created a different kind of warfare than Vikings had experienced before. Not just quick raids against defenceless targets, but sustained military campaigns against opponents who understood their methods and could fight back effectively. Meanwhile, Danish Vikings were choosing a completely different strategy. They focused on England and northern France, regions that offered different opportunities than the Celtic West. England was richer than Ireland, but also better defended. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had professional armies and fortified towns that couldn't be overcome by small raiding parties. Danish strategy evolved to match this reality. Instead of establishing island bases like the Norwegians, Danish Vikings began forming large military coalitions. The Great Army that would later conquer much of England started as an alliance between multiple Danish chieftains who agreed to pool their resources for major campaigns. This approach required more organisation and planning than simple raiding. Diplomatic negotiations between Danish leaders, careful coordination of supply lines, strategic thinking about long-term conquest rather than quick profit. The Danish focus on England also reflected different economic calculations. English kingdoms controlled extensive agricultural land that could support much larger populations than Irish cattle raids ever could. Conquering England meant not just taking wealth, but taking the systems that produced wealth continuously. Danish expansion into France followed similar logic. The Frankish Empire was the richest political entity in Western Europe, but it was also the most heavily defended. Attacking France required the largest possible forces and the most sophisticated planning. Danish raids up the Seine River toward Paris tested Frankish defences throughout the 840s and 850s. They discovered that Frankish armies were formidable in open battle, but struggled to counter Viking mobility and unpredictability. The Siege of Paris in 845 showed how Danish strategy was evolving. Instead of simply raiding and withdrawing, the Danish force under chieftain Ragnar demanded tribute from the Frankish king Charles the Bald. This was extortion on a royal scale, treating entire kingdoms as sources of regular income rather than one-time targets. Swedish Vikings chose yet another direction. They looked east across the Baltic Sea toward the rivers and forests of what would become Russia and Ukraine. This eastern expansion was different from both Norwegian and Danish approaches. The Swedish Vikings weren't primarily interested in raiding wealthy monasteries or conquering agricultural kingdoms. They were following trade routes that could connect Scandinavia to the richest markets in the medieval world. Byzantine Constantinople and the Islamic Caliphate in Baghdad represented commercial opportunities that dwarfed anything available in Western Europe. But reaching these markets required crossing thousands of miles of territory controlled by Slavic tribes and nomadic peoples. Swedish strategy focused on establishing trading posts and transport networks rather than conquest for its own sake. They needed local cooperation to move goods safely across such vast distances. The Swedish expansion began around 830 with expeditions across the Baltic to the mouth of the Neva River. From there, Swedish traders and warriors pushed south along river systems that led deep into the continental interior. By 860, Swedish Vikings had established a major stronghold at Kiev, hundreds of miles from the Baltic coast. This wasn't achieved through military conquest alone. It required diplomatic relationships with Slavic leaders and careful negotiation of trading rights. The Swedish approach created something unprecedented in Viking expansion, a multinational commercial network that benefited everyone involved rather than simply extracting wealth from conquered territories. Slavic communities provided agricultural surplus, raw materials, and local knowledge of river navigation. Swedish Vikings contributed maritime technology, metalworking skills, and connections to Scandinavian markets. The combination created prosperity for both groups. Archaeological evidence from sites like Staraya Ladoga shows how this cooperation worked in practice. Swedish artifacts mixed with Slavic pottery, Scandinavian tools used to process local materials, trading posts that served both cultures simultaneously. But the eastern expansion also created something more significant. The first European contact with truly global trade networks. Swedish Vikings following Russian rivers eventually reached the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. This gave them access to Byzantine and Islamic merchants who could offer goods from across Asia and Africa. By 870, Swedish traders were selling Scandinavian amber and furs in Constantinople's markets. They were bringing Byzantine silk and Islamic silver back to Sweden. Most remarkably, they were participating in trade networks that stretched from Greenland to India. This created wealth that transformed Swedish society. Archaeological finds from this period show an explosion of luxury goods in Swedish settlements. Not just stolen treasure, but sophisticated manufactured items from the most advanced civilizations in the medieval world. The three-directional expansion also created something unexpected: competition between different Scandinavian groups that hadn't existed before. Norwegian Vikings operating from Dublin began encountering Danish Vikings raiding along England's west coast. Swedish traders moving down Russian rivers found Danish merchants already established in some of the same markets. Overlapping territorial claims created tensions that sometimes erupted into open warfare between different Viking groups. This internal competition actually accelerated Viking expansion. When Norwegian and Danish forces clashed over control of particular territories, the losing side often responded by pushing further into unexplored regions rather than accepting defeat. The competitive pressure also drove technological and tactical innovation. Each group tried to develop advantages that would give them superiority over their Scandinavian rivals, as well as their non-Scandinavian enemies. By 870, the pattern was clear. Vikings weren't just raiders anymore. They were colonists, conquerors, traders, and city builders. They controlled territory from Ireland to Russia. They had established permanent settlements that were growing into major medieval cities. More importantly, they had created the first truly international culture in medieval Europe. A Scandinavian merchant could travel from Dublin to Kiev and find communities that shared his language, laws, and customs. This kind of cultural continuity across vast distances hadn't existed since the Roman Empire, but the expansion was also creating problems that simple raiding had never faced. Governing conquered territories required different skills than attacking them. Managing complex trade relationships demanded diplomatic sophistication that warrior culture didn't always provide. European resistance was becoming more organized and effective. The kingdoms and peoples that had been surprised by early Viking attacks were learning to fight back using Viking methods against Viking forces. Most challenging of all, the three-directional expansion was pushing Vikings toward the absolute limits of medieval transportation and communication. The distances between Dublin, York and Kiev were so vast that coordinating activities between different Viking settlements was becoming impossible. Success was creating new kinds of challenges that would test whether Viking society could adapt to circumstances completely different from the desperate farming communities that had first launched longships toward Lindisfarne. The world was getting bigger and smaller at the same time. Bigger because Vikings were discovering just how much territory lay beyond Scandinavia's traditional borders. Smaller because their ships and trade networks were connecting previously isolated regions for the first time in history. But even these vast expanses were about to prove insufficient for Viking ambitions. Some of the most adventurous Norse explorers were already looking beyond Ireland, beyond England, beyond Russia, toward horizons that didn't appear on any existing map. While Vikings were conquering Ireland and England and Russia, some of the most restless Norse explorers were looking even further. past the edges of every map that existed, into waters that no European had ever sailed. These weren't the desperate farmers who had first raided Lindisfarne. By 860, Viking society had produced a new type of person. Professional adventurers who thrived on the unknown. Men and women who saw empty ocean as opportunity rather than barrier. The first great leap beyond the known world happened almost by accident. Around 860, a Norwegian chieftain named Nadod was sailing from Norway to the Faroe Islands when a severe storm blew his ship far off course. For 3 days his crew fought mountainous waves and howling winds. When the storm finally cleared, they found themselves approaching an island that wasn't supposed to exist. This island was enormous. Snow-capped mountains rose from the sea like sleeping giants. Steam vented from valleys that suggested volcanic activity. The coastline stretched beyond the horizon in both directions. Nadod had discovered Iceland, a landmass larger than Ireland sitting in the North Atlantic 800 miles from the nearest European settlement. The discovery created immediate excitement back in Norway. An entire island with no existing population. Rich fishing grounds, geothermal springs that could provide heat through Arctic winters, meadows that might support livestock and limited agriculture. But Iceland also represented something more profound. Proof that the ocean contained lands that no one had ever imagined. If one unknown island existed, others might be waiting even further from shore. The systematic settlement of Iceland began in 874 under the leadership of Ingolfur Arnarson, a Norwegian chieftain fleeing political conflicts at home. This wasn't a desperate exile. It was a carefully planned colonization effort designed to establish a permanent Scandinavian society in previously empty territory. Ingolfur chose his settlement site using traditional Viking methods. He threw his carved wooden throne pillars into the sea as his ship approached the Icelandic coast. Where the pillars washed ashore would determine the location of his new home. They came to rest in a bay with natural harbours and freshwater springs. He named the place Reykjavik, Smoky Bay, because of steam rising from geothermal vents. The early Icelandic settlers faced challenges unlike anything Vikings had encountered before. The growing season was shorter than in Scandinavia. Winter darkness lasted for months. Volcanic eruptions could destroy entire districts without warning, but they also discovered resources that made survival possible. Abundant fish in coastal waters, seabirds that provided eggs and meat through summer months, driftwood carried by ocean currents from North American forests thousands of miles away. Most importantly, they found they could adapt traditional Scandinavian practices to Arctic conditions. Sheep and cattle could survive Icelandic winters if provided with enough hay. Traditional Viking construction techniques created buildings that retained heat efficiently during months of darkness. Archaeological evidence from early Icelandic settlements shows remarkable innovation in extreme weather architecture. Houses built partially underground for insulation. Clever chimney systems that captured and recycled heat. Designs that minimized fuel consumption while maximizing warmth. By 930, Iceland supported a population of nearly 20,000 Scandinavian settlers. They had established the world's first parliament, the Althing, which met annually at a dramatic levurfield called Thingvellir. This wasn't just a governing body. It was a social event that brought together people scattered across an island larger than most European kingdoms. The Icelandic experiment proved something remarkable about Viking adaptability. Given sufficient resources and planning, Scandinavian settlers could create thriving communities in environments that seemed impossibly harsh. This confidence would soon push exploration even further from civilization. The next leap beyond the known world came through exile and accident rather than planning. Erik Thorvaldsson, later known as Erik the Red, was banned from Iceland around 982 for killing several men in a land dispute. Icelandic law required him to leave the island for 3 years. Most exiles chose to return to Norway or join Viking settlements elsewhere in Europe. Erik chose differently. He decided to explore rumours about land even further west than Iceland. Icelandic sailors had occasionally reported glimpses of mountains beyond the western horizon during unusually clear weather. Some claim to have seen birds that didn't nest in Iceland flying from the west during migration seasons. Driftwood patterns suggested large land masses somewhere across the Denmark Strait. Eric outfitted a single ship with supplies for extended exploration. His crew included family members and close friends willing to risk everything on his judgment. In 982, they sailed west from Iceland toward whatever lay beyond the visible world. After several days of sailing through ice-filled waters, they reached the largest island anyone had ever seen. Massive glaciers covered much of the interior, but the southern and western coasts contained green valleys that looked suitable for settlement. Eric spent 3 years exploring this enormous island. He mapped coastlines, identified potential settlement sites, and tested whether traditional Scandinavian agriculture might be possible in selected locations. What he discovered was both promising and challenging. The island contained extensive grasslands suitable for livestock, rivers full of salmon, sea mammals that could provide oil and meat through long winters. But the climate was more severe than Iceland, and the growing season even shorter. Eric named his discovery Greenland. This wasn't just optimistic marketing. The southern regions he explored were actually green during summer months. Vegetation was limited but sufficient to support careful farming and extensive livestock raising. When Eric returned to Iceland in 985, he brought samples of Greenland products and detailed descriptions of settlement opportunities. His timing was perfect. Iceland was becoming crowded, and many families were interested in new territories where they could establish their own farms. In 986, Eric led a colonization fleet of 25 ships carrying nearly 700 settlers toward Greenland. Only 14 ships completed the journey. The others were lost to storms, pack ice, or navigation errors. But the survivors established 2 permanent settlements that would endure for over 4 centuries. The eastern settlement, located in what is now southern Greenland, became home to nearly 4,000 people at its peak. The western settlement, further up the coast, supported about 1,500 residents. These weren't just survival camps. They were prosperous farming communities that exported walrus ivory, seal oil, and polar bear pelts to European markets. Archaeological excavations at sites like Brata Lead, Eric's own farm, reveal sophisticated adaptation to Arctic conditions. Churches built from local stone, irrigation systems that maximize limited growing seasons, workshops that produced high-quality crafts for both local use and export. But Greenland also pushed Viking expansion to its practical limits. The voyage from Iceland was dangerous even in good weather. Supply ships could only make the crossing during brief summer months. Communication with the outside world was irregular and unreliable. Despite these challenges, Greenlandic Vikings continued pushing exploration further west. They had learned that even seemingly impossible territories might contain unexpected opportunities for settlement and resource extraction. Around 1000, Eric's son Leif Erikson decided to investigate reports of land beyond Greenland's western coast. Inuit hunters occasionally spoke of territories across the Davis Strait, where forests grew large enough to provide substantial timber. This was crucial information for Greenlandic settlers. Wood was their scarcest resource. Everything had to be imported from Europe or salvaged from driftwood. Access to proper forests would transform Greenlandic economy and construction capabilities. Leif assembled a crew of 35 men for what would become the most ambitious exploration voyage in Viking history. They sailed west from Greenland into completely unknown waters, following bird migration patterns and ocean current indicators toward whatever lay beyond the visible horizon. After several days of sailing, they reached a coastline unlike anything any European had ever seen. Enormous forests of pine and maple stretched inland beyond sight. Rivers full of salmon larger than any found in European waters. Meadows covered with wild grapes that could be used for winemaking. Leif named this discovery Vinland, Wineland, because of the abundance of grapes his crew found growing wild. Archaeological evidence suggests they had reached the coast of North America, probably in what is now Newfoundland or New Brunswick. The Norse explorers established a temporary settlement at a site they called Leifsbuda, Leif's Shelters. They spent the winter cutting timber, exploring the coastline, and evaluating the potential for permanent colonization. What they discovered was both exciting and troubling. North America contained resources that could make Greenland prosper beyond anything previously imagined. Unlimited timber, abundant wildlife, fertile soil that could support much larger populations than Arctic farming ever could. But they also encountered something Vikings had never faced before. Indigenous peoples who were numerous, well-organized, and completely unimpressed by European technology or tactics. The Native Americans that Vikings called Skraelings proved to be formidable opponents who understood their own territory much better than any foreign visitors possibly could. Initial trading relationships quickly deteriorated into armed conflict that made permanent settlement extremely dangerous. Archaeological excavations at Lonceau Meadows in Newfoundland have uncovered the remains of what appears to be Leif's settlement. Norse artifacts mixed with evidence of ironworking, ship repair, and timber processing. This site represents the first confirmed European presence in North America, 5 centuries before Columbus. The physical evidence shows that Vikings spent at least several months, possibly multiple years, attempting to establish a permanent foothold in North America. But the combination of indigenous resistance and supply line difficulties eventually forced them to abandon their American settlements. Leif and his crew returned to Greenland with stories of incredible wealth lying just beyond their ability to claim it safely. Several follow-up expeditions attempted to establish permanent American colonies over the next decade, but all failed due to the same combination of distance and local opposition. The failed American settlements mark the absolute limit of Viking expansion. They had pushed exploration to the point where even their superior ships and navigation skills couldn't overcome the challenges of distance, climate, and organized resistance. But the attempt itself was remarkable. Viking explorers had crossed the Atlantic Ocean using medieval technology and established temporary settlements in territories that wouldn't see European visitors again for 5 centuries. The Greenland colony survived much longer, but they too eventually succumbed to challenges that exceeded Viking adaptability. Climate change during the Little Ice Age made already difficult farming nearly impossible. Supply connections with Europe became increasingly unreliable. The Inuit population expansion put pressure on resources that could no longer support both cultures. By 1400, both Greenland settlements had been abandoned. The last Vikings in America simply vanished from historical record, leaving behind only archaeological evidence of one of humanity's most ambitious attempts to settle in Earth's harshest environments. But their failure was also a kind of success. They had proven that human determination and ingenuity could reach any place on the planet given sufficient motivation and skill. The techniques they developed for extreme weather survival would influence Arctic exploration for centuries. More importantly, they had demonstrated that the Viking Age was about much more than raiding and conquest. It was about the restless human desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon, no matter how dangerous or impossible the journey might seem. The explorers who had started by crossing the North Sea to raid Lindisfarne had ended by crossing the Atlantic Ocean to discover America. The transformation from desperate farmers to global explorers was complete. While Leif Erikson was discovering America and Eric the Red was settling Greenland, a different group of Vikings was creating something equally remarkable in the opposite direction. Swedish explorers were pushing east across the Baltic Sea toward rivers that led deeper into the continental interior than any Scandinavian had ever travelled. This eastern expansion was completely different from the western adventures. There were no empty islands waiting to be settled, no defenceless monasteries filled with easy treasure. The Swedish Vikings were entering territories controlled by Slavic tribes, nomadic peoples, and established kingdoms that had their own armies and political systems. Success would require diplomacy, not just superior ships and weapons. The Swedish eastward movement began around 750, even before the famous raid on Lindisfarne. But these early expeditions weren't military campaigns. They were trading voyages designed to establish commercial relationships with peoples who controlled valuable resources. Sweden's geography made eastern expansion logical. The Baltic Sea provided safe passage to river mouths that led deep into what would become Russia and Ukraine. Swedish communities were already skilled at navigating rivers and lakes for internal transportation. Adapting these techniques for longer distances was a natural development. The first major Swedish stronghold was established around 753 at a site called Staraya Ladoga, near modern St. Petersburg. Archaeological excavations there reveal something remarkable. This wasn't a conquered fortress or raiding base. It was a multinational trading post where Swedish Vikings worked alongside Slavic merchants and craftsmen. The physical evidence shows peaceful cooperation rather than military domination. Swedish metalworking tools mixed with Slavic pottery. Scandinavian ship construction techniques adapted for river navigation. Workshops where both cultures contributed skills and knowledge to shared projects. The Swedish approach worked because it offered benefits to everyone involved. Slavic communities gained access to superior Scandinavian metalworking, shipbuilding, and navigation techniques. Swedish traders got access to resources that were rare or non-existent in Scandinavia. Fur, honey, amber, and most importantly slaves who could be sold in southern markets. The cooperation wasn't always peaceful. Competition for resources and territory sometimes led to armed conflict. But both sides quickly learned that warfare was much less profitable than trade. Destroying potential trading partners eliminated future opportunities for mutual benefit. From Staraya Ladoga, Swedish expeditions began following river systems that led further south. The Volkhov River connected to Lake Ilmen, then to the Lovat River, then to the Dnieper system that eventually reached the Black Sea. Each river junction required negotiation with local Slavic princes who controlled territory and trading rights. By 830, Swedish Vikings had established a major stronghold at Novgorod, meaning new city in Slavic languages. This name itself tells an important story. The Slavs themselves were acknowledging that Swedish presence was creating something new in their territory. Not conquest, but transformation. Archaeological evidence from early Novgorod shows sophisticated urban planning that combined Scandinavian and Slavic traditions. Street layouts that maximized river access for Swedish longships. Public spaces designed for the assemblies that were central to Scandinavian governance. Markets organized around the kinds of long-distance trade that Swedish merchants specialized in. But Novgorod was just the beginning. The real prize lay much further south, where the Russian river systems connected to Byzantine and Islamic trade networks that stretched across Asia and Africa. Around 860, a Swedish expedition led by a chieftain named Rurik established an even more ambitious settlement at Kiev, nearly 800 miles south of the Baltic coast. This location was brilliant for several reasons. Kiev controlled the Dnieper River's middle reaches, making it a natural collecting point for trade goods moving north and south. The surrounding countryside was fertile enough to support a large population. Most importantly, Kiev was close enough to Constantinople to establish direct diplomatic and commercial relationships with the Byzantine Empire. The Swedish Vikings who settled in Kiev faced challenges that their Western counterparts never encountered. They were operating in territories where local populations outnumbered them hundreds to one. Military conquest was impossible. Survival required integration with existing political systems and cultural practices. This led to something unprecedented in Viking history. Scandinavian settlers who gradually adopted Slavic customs, laws, and even language while maintaining their connections to Swedish homeland and trading networks. The process created a new kind of society that archaeologists call the Kievan Rus. Neither purely Scandinavian nor purely Slavic, but a hybrid culture that combined the best elements of both traditions. Swedish organizational skills and Slavic agricultural knowledge, Scandinavian shipbuilding expertise and Slavic understanding of continental river navigation. Archaeological finds from this period show the remarkable cultural mixing that occurred. Swedish-style weapons buried according to Slavic funeral customs. Slavic pottery decorated with Scandinavian artistic motifs. Houses built using Scandinavian construction techniques but adapted for continental climate patterns. The Swedish Vikings in Russia also created something that their Western counterparts couldn't match. truly long-distance trade networks that connected the Arctic Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea and beyond. By 870, Swedish merchants were regularly travelling from the Baltic to Constantinople, a journey of nearly 2,000 miles that required crossing dozens of territories controlled by different peoples. The logistics were staggering. Coordinating supplies, negotiating passage rights, managing seasonal variations in river levels and ice conditions, but the profits were equally staggering. Byzantine markets paid premium prices for northern European furs, amber and honey. Islamic merchants in Constantinople offered silk, spices and silver that commanded enormous prices when transported back to Scandinavia. Archaeological evidence of this trade appears across Sweden in the form of Arabic silver coins, Byzantine silk fragments, and exotic spices that could only have come from Asian markets. Some Swedish burial sites from this period contain more wealth than comparable graves anywhere else in medieval Europe. The Eastern trade also created opportunities that went beyond simple commerce. Swedish Vikings began serving as mercenaries in Byzantine armies. Their reputation as fierce fighters and skilled sailors made them valuable additions to imperial military forces. By 988, Swedish Vikings formed the core of the Varangian Guard, the Byzantine emperor's elite personal troops. This was an extraordinary development. Scandinavian warriors serving as the primary military force, protecting the ruler of medieval Europe's most sophisticated civilization. The Varangian Guard wasn't just a military position. It was a diplomatic institution that connected Scandinavian societies directly to Byzantine political and cultural systems. Swedish guardsmen returned home with detailed knowledge of imperial administration, military technology, and religious practices. Archaeological evidence shows that former Varangian guards became influential leaders in Swedish communities. They brought back not just wealth, but administrative techniques and technological innovations that transformed Scandinavian society. The most famous Varangian was probably Harald Hardrada, who served in Constantinople before becoming King of Norway and launching the failed invasion of England in 1066. His career shows how the Eastern connections created opportunities for individual advancement that didn't exist anywhere else in the Viking world. But the Eastern expansion also created something more profound than individual success stories. It established the first truly transcontinental trade network in medieval Europe. Goods moved regularly from Greenland to Baghdad along routes controlled largely by Scandinavian merchants and their Slavic partners. Walrus ivory from Arctic settlements travelled down Russian rivers to Constantinople, where it was traded for Byzantine gold that eventually funded new expeditions to America. This network operated on a scale that wouldn't be matched again until the Age of Exploration 5 centuries later. Medieval maps show trading posts and settlements stretching from the North Sea to the Caspian Sea, all connected by river routes that Swedish Vikings had mapped and developed. The cultural impact was equally significant. Ideas and technology spread along these trade routes much faster than they could travel overland. Islamic mathematical techniques reached Scandinavia centuries before they appeared in Western Europe. Byzantine architectural styles influenced church construction in Sweden and Norway. Religious exchange was particularly important. Swedish Vikings encountered Orthodox Christianity in Constantinople and Islamic practices in the Volga region. Many converted to Christianity not through conquest or missionary activity, but through exposure to different religious traditions during trading expeditions. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing religious diversity in Swedish communities. Christian symbols mixed with traditional pagan artifacts, churches built using Byzantine architectural models, burial practices that combined Scandinavian customs with Orthodox Christian rituals. The Eastern expansion also created the foundation for what would eventually become Russia and Ukraine. The political structures that Swedish Vikings established at Novgorod and Kiev evolved into the medieval kingdoms that dominated Eastern Europe for centuries. The name Russia itself probably derives from Rus, the Slavic term for Swedish Vikings. This linguistic connection reflects the profound influence that Scandinavian political and military organization had on Eastern European development. but the eastern expansion was always more fragile than Viking achievements in the west. The enormous distances made communication and control extremely difficult. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of territory, controlled by peoples who had their own political agendas. Climate change during the medieval warm period helped make the river routes more navigable. But when temperatures began cooling around 1150, ice conditions made travel much more dangerous, and seasonal patterns less predictable. Political changes in Byzantium also affected Swedish opportunities. As the empire weakened during the 11th and 12th centuries, demand for Varangian services decreased, and payment for northern European goods became less reliable. Most significantly, the Mongol invasions of the 13th century completely disrupted the trade networks that had sustained Swedish presence in Eastern Europe. Cities like Kiev were destroyed or abandoned. River routes became too dangerous for regular commercial travel. Archaeological evidence shows a sharp decline in Scandinavian artifacts at Russian sites after 1200. The cultural mixing that had characterized earlier periods gave way to more purely Slavic material culture, as Swedish influence gradually disappeared. By 1300, the Swedish Viking presence in Russia had largely ended. The descendants of Swedish settlers had become fully integrated into Slavic societies or had returned to Scandinavia. The remarkable experiment in transcontinental commerce and cultural exchange was over, but the legacy remained. The political structures that Swedish Vikings had helped establish continued to influence Eastern European development for centuries. The trade routes they had pioneered remained important for regional commerce, even after transcontinental connections were severed. Most importantly, the eastern expansion had demonstrated something remarkable about Viking capabilities. Given sufficient motivation and resources, Scandinavian societies could adapt to completely unfamiliar environments and create successful partnerships with peoples whose cultures were entirely different from their own. The Swedish Vikings, who had started by crossing the Baltic to find trading opportunities, had ended by creating a commercial network that spanned half the known world. They had proven that the Viking Age was about much more than raiding and conquest. It was about the human capacity to build connections across any distance, no matter how challenging the obstacles might seem. The eastern rivers had carried Swedish explorers further from home than even the boldest Western adventurers had travelled, and unlike the failed American settlements, the eastern expansion had created lasting changes that influenced the development of entire civilizations. While Swedish Vikings were establishing trade networks in Russia, something much more dramatic was happening in England. The age of small raiding parties was ending. Danish Vikings were about to launch the largest military campaign in medieval European history. By 865, 3 generations of successful raids had taught Danish chieftains important lessons. England contained more wealth than any other target they had discovered. But that wealth was protected by professional armies and fortified towns that couldn't be overcome by traditional hit-and-run tactics. The solution was obvious: stop raiding and start conquering. The great heathen army that landed in East Anglia during autumn 865 was unlike anything England had ever faced. This wasn't a few hundred raiders looking for quick treasure. It was a coordinated invasion force of several thousand warriors drawn from across Denmark and southern Sweden. Archaeological evidence suggests the army included not just fighters, but entire families planning permanent settlement. Blacksmiths to maintain weapons and tools, craftsmen to build fortifications, farmers to establish agricultural production in conquered territory. This was colonization on a massive scale. The army's leadership reflected the new scale of Viking ambitions. Ivar the Boneless, probably called that because of his strategic flexibility rather than any physical condition. Halfdan Ragnarsson, whose tactical innovations would reshape medieval warfare. Ubba, whose reputation for ruthlessness made enemies surrender rather than fight. These weren't just successful raiders promoted beyond their abilities. They were sophisticated military commanders who understood logistics, engineering, and the political complexities of governing conquered populations. The Great Army's first target was carefully chosen. East Anglia was rich but relatively weak compared to the major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Its king, Edmund, commanded respect. but not the military resources needed to resist a force this size. The invasion began with something unprecedented in Viking warfare: formal negotiations. The Danish commanders didn't just attack and hope for the best. They sent envoys to King Edmund demanding tribute, territory, and recognition of Danish authority. This diplomatic approach reveals how Viking strategy was evolving. The goal wasn't just to steal wealth and leave, it was to establish permanent political control that could generate wealth continuously for generations. King Edmund refused the Danish demands. Archaeological evidence from his royal hall at Rendlesham shows hasty preparations for siege warfare. Defensive ditches dug around the main buildings, weapons and food stockpiled for extended resistance. But the Anglo-Saxon defensive preparations were based on outdated assumptions about how Viking attacks worked. Edmund expected raids that could be waited out behind fortifications. Instead, he faced a systematic military campaign designed to eliminate organised resistance permanently. The Danish attack on Edmund's stronghold demonstrated revolutionary siege techniques that most European armies hadn't seen before. Mobile assault towers that could be assembled quickly from ships' timbers, coordinated attacks from multiple directions that prevented effective defence. Most importantly, the patience to maintain siege operations for weeks or months rather than days. The siege ended with Edmund's capture and execution. Later Christian sources claimed he was killed for refusing to renounce his faith, creating the legend of St. Edmund. But contemporary evidence suggests his death was primarily political. The Danish commanders needed to demonstrate that resistance was futile. With East Anglia secured, the Great Army moved north toward more challenging targets. York, the capital of Northumbria, was one of medieval England's most important cities. Its capture would give the Vikings control of northern England's political and economic centre. The attack on York in 866 showed how Danish strategy had evolved beyond anything previous Viking forces had attempted. Instead of direct assault on the city's walls, they exploited Northumbrian political divisions. Northumbria was experiencing civil war between two rival claimants to the throne. The Danish commanders offered military support to one faction in exchange for territorial concessions. When their chosen candidate gained power, he discovered that Danish support meant effective Danish control. Archaeological excavations in York reveal the extent of Danish transformation of the city. Scandinavian-style buildings replaced Anglo-Saxon structures. New workshops established to produce Danish weapons and tools, harbour modifications to accommodate the larger ships that supplied the invasion force. But the most significant change was political. York became the capital of what would later be called the Kingdom of Jorvik, a Scandinavian state in the heart of England that operated according to Danish law and custom. From their York stronghold, Danish forces began systematic conquest of the Midlands. The Kingdom of Mercia, which had dominated central England for centuries, fell piece by piece to coordinated Danish campaigns. These weren't chaotic raids driven by short-term greed. They were carefully planned military operations designed to establish permanent Danish control over England's richest agricultural regions. The Danish approach to conquest was sophisticated in ways that medieval European warfare rarely achieved. Instead of simply destroying everything they couldn't carry away, they preserved the economic systems that generated wealth. Anglo-Saxon farmers continued working their fields under Danish supervision. Existing trade networks were maintained and expanded to include Scandinavian markets. Local craftsmen were encouraged to adapt their skills to Danish preferences and needs. Archaeological evidence from Danish-controlled territories shows remarkable economic continuity during the conquest period. Agricultural production actually increased in some areas as Danish organisational skills improved local farming techniques. But the Danish success created an unexpected problem. They had conquered most of England except for one stubborn kingdom in the southwest. Wessex, ruled by a young king named Alfred, proved much more difficult to defeat than anyone had anticipated. Alfred had learned from the defeats of other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Instead of meeting Danish armies in open battle, he developed defensive strategies specifically designed to counter Viking advantages. The key was understanding that Danish strength came from mobility and surprise. Alfred built a network of fortified towns called burhs that could shelter local populations during Danish attacks. He also created a standing army that could respond quickly to threats anywhere in his territory. Most importantly, Alfred learned to use ships. He built a royal navy designed specifically to counter Danish longships. These weren't just copies of Viking vessels. They were larger, more heavily armed ships designed to fight Danish forces at sea, where their mobility advantage was reduced. The confrontation between Alfred and the Great Army reached its climax at the Battle of Edington in 878. This wasn't just a military clash. It was a test of whether Anglo-Saxon resistance could survive Danish conquest methods. Alfred's victory at Edington was narrow but decisive. The Danish army was forced to retreat from Wessex and accept formal borders between Danish-controlled territory and Alfred's kingdom. But the real significance of Edington was what happened after the battle. Instead of trying to drive all Danish forces out of England, Alfred negotiated a peace treaty that recognised Danish control over northeastern England in exchange for Danish recognition of his authority over the southwest. This created something unprecedented in early medieval Europe: a formal division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Danish zones of control. The Danish area became known as the Danelaw, territory where Danish law and custom were officially recognised. Archaeological evidence from Danelaw settlements shows how this arrangement worked in practice. Danish and Anglo-Saxon communities often existed side by side, sometimes in the same villages. Intermarriage was common. Cultural exchange was extensive. The linguistic impact was profound and permanent. Modern English contains thousands of words borrowed from Old Norse during this period. Basic vocabulary like sky, egg, knife, and husband came from Danish settlers. Even common pronouns like they, them, and their replaced Anglo-Saxon equivalents. Legal traditions also merged in ways that influenced English law for centuries. Danish concepts of individual rights and local self-governance combined with Anglo-Saxon traditions of royal authority and Christian law. The result was a legal system more sophisticated than either culture had developed independently. The Great Army's success also transformed Danish society back in Scandinavia. Wealth flowing back from English conquests funded new expeditions and larger ship construction projects. Danish kings gained prestige that allowed them to dominate other Scandinavian rulers. But governing conquered English territory required different skills than conquering it had. Danish commanders had to learn diplomacy, law-making, and economic management. They had to balance the interests of Danish settlers with the needs of much larger Anglo-Saxon populations. Some adapted successfully to these challenges. Archaeological evidence from Danish settlements shows sophisticated urban planning and economic development that benefited both cultures. Cities like York and Lincoln became major commercial centres that attracted merchants from across northern Europe. Others struggled with the transition from warrior to administrator. The skills that made someone an effective military commander didn't necessarily translate to effective governance of diverse populations with different cultural traditions. By 900, the first generation of Danish conquerors was being replaced by their children and grandchildren. These second-generation Danish-English leaders had grown up in England. They spoke both languages fluently. They understood both legal traditions intimately. Archaeological evidence shows increasing cultural integration during this period. Danish artistic styles influenced by Anglo-Saxon traditions. Anglo-Saxon metalworking techniques adopted by Danish craftsmen. Religious practices that combined Scandinavian and Christian elements. The integration was most visible in the great trading cities that developed in the Danelaw. York, Lincoln, and Stamford became commercial centres that rivaled anything in contemporary Europe. Streets filled with workshops producing goods for markets stretching from Ireland to Russia. But the cultural mixing also created tensions that would influence English history for centuries. Danish settlers maintained connections to Scandinavia that sometimes conflicted with their loyalties to English territories. Anglo-Saxon populations accepted Danish rule, but retained their own cultural identity and political aspirations. The Great Army had achieved something unprecedented in Viking history. They had conquered and successfully governed territories much larger and richer than anything Scandinavian societies had previously controlled. They had created a new kind of medieval state that combined the best elements of both cultures. But success also created new vulnerabilities. The wealth and territory that Danish conquest had gained now had to be defended against other ambitious rulers. Alfred's successors in Wessex were learning Danish military techniques and planning campaigns to reconquer the Danelaw. More challenging still, the very success of English conquest was attracting attention from other Scandinavian rulers who wanted their own share of English wealth. The Great Army had opened England to systematic Viking exploitation, but they couldn't prevent other Viking forces from challenging their control. By 920, Danish control of northeastern England was secure but not uncontested. The age of easy conquest was ending. The Danelaw would have to defend itself against Anglo-Saxon reconquest attempts and rival Scandinavian forces seeking their own English territories. The farmers who had first crossed the North Sea to raid Lindisfarne had become kings ruling territories larger than most European kingdoms. But ruling successfully would prove even more challenging than conquering had been. The Great Army had transformed not just England, but the entire concept of what Viking society could achieve. They had proven that Scandinavian organizational skills could create and govern complex medieval states. The question now was whether those states could survive the internal and external pressures that success inevitably created. The success of the Great Army in England created something unexpected. Viking leaders who had started as raiders were now governing territories larger than most European kingdoms. But ruling successfully required different skills than conquering had. Some Danish commanders adapted to these new challenges better than others. The most dramatic transformation happened not in England, but in northern France. Around 885, a Norwegian chieftain named Rollo was leading Viking raids up the Seine River toward Paris. These weren't desperate attacks by hungry farmers. Rollo commanded a professional army that had learned from Danish successes in England. His forces moved with discipline and strategic purpose that impressed even their enemies. But Rollo's raids came at a time when the Frankish Empire was fragmenting under pressure from multiple Viking attacks. King Charles the Simple faced rebellions from his own nobles, while trying to defend against Scandinavian forces that seemed to appear everywhere at once. Traditional military responses weren't working. Frankish armies could win individual battles, but couldn't prevent Viking forces from returning year after year. The cost of constant warfare was bankrupting royal treasuries and exhausting noble patience with royal leadership. In 911, Charles made a revolutionary decision. Instead of trying to defeat Rollo militarily, he offered to make him Duke of Normandy in exchange for defending northern France against other Viking attacks. This wasn't just a practical arrangement. It was formal recognition that Viking military leadership had earned legitimate political authority within European feudal systems. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte created something unprecedented in medieval politics. A Scandinavian pagan ruler officially governing Christian territory under the authority of a Frankish king. Rollo accepted baptism as part of the agreement, but archaeological evidence suggests this conversion was more political than spiritual. Archaeological excavations at Rouen, Rollo's new capital, show how carefully he balanced Scandinavian and Frankish traditions. The ducal palace combined Norse architectural elements with Frankish ceremonial spaces. Legal documents were written in Latin but incorporated Scandinavian concepts of individual rights and assembly governance. Rollo's success as Duke of Normandy demonstrated that Viking organizational skills could adapt to European feudal systems without losing their distinctive characteristics. He established administrative structures that were more efficient than traditional Frankish governance while maintaining the military effectiveness that had made Viking forces so successful. The transformation wasn't limited to political structures. Norman society under Rollo developed a unique culture that combined the best elements of both traditions. Scandinavian seamanship and metalworking skills enhanced by Frankish agricultural techniques and architectural knowledge. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable innovation during Rollo's reign. Ship construction techniques that improved on traditional longship designs. fortification methods that combined Viking rapid construction capabilities with Frankish defensive engineering, agricultural practices that increased crop yields while maintaining Scandinavian livestock management traditions. But the most significant change was generational. Rollo's son William Longsword and grandson Richard the Fearless grew up as European nobles who happened to have Scandinavian ancestry, rather than as Scandinavians who had acquired European territories. By 950, Norman society had evolved into something entirely new, neither purely Viking nor purely Frankish, but a hybrid culture that retained Scandinavian military effectiveness while adopting European political sophistication. The Norman model influenced Viking leaders across northern Europe. If Rollo could become a legitimate duke through military skill and political negotiation, other Scandinavian commanders could pursue similar opportunities. The most ambitious example was Knut the Great, whose career showed just how far Viking political evolution could go. Knut started as the son of Swene Forkbeard, a Danish king who had conquered England in 1013 but died before consolidating his victory. When Knut inherited his father's army in 1014, he was just a teenage commander trying to hold together a military coalition that included Danes, Norwegians, and English supporters. Traditional Viking leadership methods weren't sufficient for this challenge. Commanding successful raids required personal courage and tactical skill. Governing multiple kingdoms required diplomatic sophistication and administrative expertise that no previous Scandinavian ruler had needed to develop. Knut's solution was revolutionary. Instead of trying to rule England as a conquered territory, he presented himself as the legitimate heir to Anglo-Saxon royal traditions. He married Emma of Normandy, connecting his dynasty to both English and Norman noble families. He retained Anglo-Saxon administrators and laws while gradually introducing Scandinavian innovations. Archaeological evidence from Knut's reign shows careful balance between different cultural traditions, royal ceremonies that combined Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon elements, coins that used English designs but incorporated Norse symbols, legal documents that preserved Anglo-Saxon law while adding Danish concepts of individual rights. By 1016, Knut controlled England completely. But unlike previous Viking conquerors, he didn't stop there. He systematically expanded his authority to include Denmark and Norway, creating the largest Scandinavian empire in medieval history. The North Sea Empire that Knut ruled from 1016 to 1035 demonstrated something remarkable about Viking political capabilities. Given sufficient resources and motivation, Scandinavian rulers could govern diverse territories more effectively than most contemporary European monarchs. Knut's administrative innovations influenced European political development for centuries. He established royal councils that included representatives from different ethnic and cultural groups. He created legal systems that protected minority rights while maintaining central authority. He developed diplomatic relationships that connected Scandinavia directly to papal and imperial courts. Archaeological evidence from across Knut's empire shows unprecedented cultural exchange during his reign. English architectural techniques appearing in Danish buildings, Scandinavian artistic styles influencing Norwegian church decoration, trade networks that connected all three kingdoms with markets across Europe and beyond. But Knut's most significant achievement was demonstrating that Viking rulers could be European statesmen without abandoning their cultural identity. He maintained Scandinavian military traditions while adopting Christian royal ideology. He preserved assembly governance while accepting feudal obligations to other European monarchs. The model spread rapidly across the Viking world. In Ireland, Norse rulers like Sigtryg Silkbeard in Dublin adopted similar strategies, presenting themselves as legitimate kings rather than foreign conquerors. Archaeological excavations at Dublin's Christchurch Cathedral show how Viking rulers used Christian architecture to demonstrate their integration into European royal culture. Scotland saw comparable developments. Viking earls in Orkney and the Hebrides established sophisticated administrative systems that governed both Scandinavian settlers and Celtic populations. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bersay shows palace complexes that rivaled anything in contemporary European courts. Even smaller Viking territories developed remarkable political sophistication. The Isle of Man became an independent kingdom that maintained connections to both Irish and English political systems while preserving distinctly Scandinavian legal and cultural traditions. Archaeological excavations at Tynwald Hill, the Manx Parliament site, reveal continuous use from the Viking period through the present day. This represents one of the world's oldest continuous democratic institutions, directly descended from Scandinavian assembly traditions. The political innovations that emerged from Viking royal courts influenced European development in ways that extended far beyond Scandinavian territories. Concepts of individual rights, representative assemblies, and legal equality that Vikings brought to their kingdoms gradually spread to neighbouring regions. The English Parliament traces its origins partly to Scandinavian assembly traditions that were introduced during the Danelaw period and refined during Cnut's reign. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought additional Scandinavian political concepts to England through William the Conqueror's Viking ancestry. But Viking political success also created internal tensions that proved difficult to resolve. Traditional Scandinavian society was built around personal loyalty between warriors and their leaders. Royal governance required impersonal administrative systems that could function regardless of individual relationships. Archaeological evidence from the later Viking period shows increasing social stratification that differed from traditional Scandinavian patterns. Royal courts with elaborate ceremonial requirements, administrative hierarchies that separated rulers from ordinary citizens, wealth concentrations that exceeded anything previous Viking societies had experienced. Some Viking communities adapted successfully to these changes. Archaeological evidence from cities like York and Dublin shows prosperous urban societies that combined Scandinavian cultural traditions with European political structures. Others struggled with the transformation. Rural Scandinavian communities sometimes rejected royal authority that seemed incompatible with traditional democratic assemblies and personal independence. The most serious challenge was religious. Viking political success increasingly required integration with Christian European systems, but conversion to Christianity challenged fundamental aspects of Scandinavian cultural identity. Archaeological evidence shows gradual religious change rather than sudden conversion, pagan symbols appearing alongside Christian imagery, churches built using Scandinavian architectural traditions, burial practices that combined Christian and pagan elements. By 1000, most Viking rulers had accepted Christianity at least nominally, but the conversion was often more political than spiritual. Archaeological evidence suggests that many Scandinavian communities maintained traditional religious practices alongside official Christian observance. The religious transformation created opportunities and problems. Christian conversion opened diplomatic relationships with papal and imperial courts that had been impossible for pagan rulers. But it also separated Viking elites from traditional sources of cultural authority. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing cultural complexity in Viking societies. Royal courts that operated according to European Christian standards, rural communities that maintained traditional Scandinavian practices, urban centres where multiple cultural traditions coexisted and influenced each other. By 1050, the transformation was largely complete. Viking rulers had become European monarchs who governed according to contemporary royal standards while maintaining distinctive Scandinavian characteristics. The success was remarkable. Descendants of desperate farmers who had first raided Lindisfarne were now ruling kingdoms that influenced European politics at the highest levels. They had proven that Scandinavian organizational skills and cultural values could adapt to any political system. But success also marked the end of the traditional Viking Age. Rulers who governed according to European feudal systems couldn't maintain the mobility and independence that had made Viking expansion possible. Royal obligations to other European monarchs conflicted with traditional Scandinavian freedoms. Archaeological evidence from the mid-11th century shows declining emphasis on traditional Viking activities. Fewer ships built for long-distance raiding, more resources devoted to territorial administration and European diplomatic relationships. The Vikings had achieved something unprecedented in medieval history. They had successfully transformed from raiders and settlers into legitimate European royalty without completely losing their cultural identity. The political innovations they developed during this transformation would influence European governance for centuries, but the transformation also meant that the age of Viking expansion and adventure was drawing to a close. The descendants of the warriors who had discovered America and established trade networks from Greenland to Constantinople were becoming European kings whose responsibilities kept them close to home. The restless energy that had driven 3 centuries of Scandinavian expansion was being channeled into the administrative challenges of governing established kingdoms, rather than the excitement of discovering new ones. The Viking Age was evolving into something completely different. Whether that evolution represented triumph or tragedy would depend on how successfully Scandinavian societies could preserve their distinctive character while adapting to European political systems that operated according to very different principles. The transformation of Viking warriors into European kings created something unexpected. Between 950 and 1050, Scandinavian civilization reached heights of sophistication that surprised even their former enemies. This wasn't just political success. It was cultural flowering on a scale that few medieval societies ever achieved. The period began with Harald Bluetooth's reign in Denmark. Harald had inherited a kingdom that controlled both sides of the Baltic Sea and much of southern Scandinavia. But unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on raiding and conquest, Harald saw opportunities for creating something entirely new. Harald's vision was revolutionary. Instead of simply extracting wealth from conquered territories, he wanted to build a Scandinavian empire that could rival the greatest powers in medieval Europe. This required transforming Viking society from the ground up. The most visible symbol of Harald's ambitions was the massive fortress complex he built at Trelleborg. Archaeological excavations reveal engineering sophistication that amazed modern researchers. Perfectly circular earthworks with precise geometric layouts. Barracks designed to house hundreds of warriors in standardized units. Storage facilities capable of supporting armies for extended campaigns. But Trelleborg wasn't just military architecture, it was a statement about Scandinavian capabilities. The precision of its construction demonstrated mathematical and engineering knowledge that rivaled anything contemporary European courts could achieve. Harald's building projects extended across Denmark. The Ravningeng Bridge, nearly half a mile long, connected previously isolated regions and demonstrated royal authority over the landscape itself. Jelling, Harald's royal centre, featured massive stone monuments that proclaimed Danish royal power in terms that any European monarch would understand. The Jelling stones represent a crucial moment in Scandinavian cultural evolution. The larger stone, erected by Harald around 965, declared that he had won for himself all of Denmark and Norway and made the Danes Christian. This wasn't just political boasting. It was a formal announcement that Scandinavian rulers had achieved legitimacy according to European Christian standards. Archaeological evidence from Harald's reign shows remarkable cultural synthesis. Traditional Scandinavian artistic styles enhanced by influences from across Europe. Metalworking techniques that combined Norse craftsmanship with Byzantine decorative traditions. Church architecture that used Scandinavian building methods to create distinctly Nordic versions of European Christian designs. But Harald's most significant achievement was creating administrative systems that could govern diverse populations effectively. Archaeological evidence from Danish towns show sophisticated urban planning during this period. Standard building codes that ensured public safety. Market regulations that protected both merchants and consumers. Legal systems that balanced traditional Scandinavian assemblies with royal authority. The success of Harald's innovations influenced Viking rulers across Scandinavia. Norway's Olaf Tryggvason, who reigned from 995 to 1000, adopted similar strategies for transforming Norwegian society. Olaf's background was quintessentially Viking. He had spent years raiding across Europe before claiming the Norwegian throne. but his approach to kingship showed how completely Scandinavian political thinking had evolved. Archaeological evidence from Olaf's reign reveals systematic efforts to modernise Norwegian society. New trading centres established at strategic locations, road networks that connected previously isolated communities, harbour improvements that accommodated the larger ships required for international commerce. Olaf's most ambitious project was religious transformation. Unlike Harold's gradual introduction of Christianity, Olaf pursued rapid conversion that would align Norway completely with European Christian civilization. The process wasn't always peaceful. Archaeological evidence shows destruction at several traditional religious sites during Olaf's reign, but it also reveals sophisticated church construction that adapted Christian architecture to Norwegian environmental conditions. The stave churches built during this period represent one of medieval Europe's most distinctive architectural achievements. Wooden structures that use traditional Scandinavian construction techniques to create spaces suitable for Christian worship. The surviving examples, like the Borgund stave church, demonstrate engineering and artistic sophistication that rivals anything built elsewhere in medieval Europe. Olaf's reign also saw remarkable literary development. The oral traditions that had preserved Scandinavian history and mythology began being written down systematically. This wasn't just cultural preservation, it was conscious creation of a literary tradition that could compete with Latin scholarship. The poetry composed during Olaf's court represents some of medieval literature's finest achievements, complex verse forms that required years of training to master, historical narratives that preserve detailed accounts of Viking expeditions and achievements, religious poetry that expressed Christian themes using traditional Scandinavian literary techniques. Archaeological evidence shows that literacy was expanding rapidly throughout Scandinavian society during this period. Runic inscriptions become more common and more sophisticated. Personal letters preserved in waterlogged deposits reveal widespread ability to read and write among ordinary citizens. The literary flowering extended beyond royal courts. Archaeological excavations at sites like Birka and Hedeby reveal evidence of schools where children learned both runic and Latin writing systems. This educational infrastructure created literate populations that could participate in the administrative and commercial systems that increasingly sophisticated Scandinavian kingdoms required. But the period's greatest achievements were probably in governance and law. Scandinavian legal systems during this period combined traditional assembly democracy with royal authority in ways that were more sophisticated than most contemporary European arrangements. Archaeological evidence from thing sites across Scandinavia shows increasing formalization of legal procedures, standardized meeting spaces designed for specific types of legal business, written records that preserved important legal decisions, appeals processes that allowed review of local assembly decisions by royal courts. The legal innovations weren't just administrative improvements, they represented fundamental advances in concepts of individual rights and governmental responsibility that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in Europe for centuries. Archaeological excavations at legal sites reveal sophisticated understanding of procedural fairness. Spaces designed to ensure that all parties could present their cases effectively, recording systems that preserved accurate accounts of legal proceedings, appeals mechanisms that protected individuals against arbitrary authority. The period also saw unprecedented prosperity throughout Scandinavian society. Archaeological evidence shows widespread access to luxury goods that had previously been available only to elite warriors and chieftains. Silver hoards from this period reveal the extent of Scandinavian commercial success. Not just Arabic coins from eastern trade routes, but silver from across medieval Europe and beyond. Some individual hoards contain wealth equivalent to several years' income for entire communities. The prosperity wasn't limited to precious metals. Archaeological evidence shows improved housing, better nutrition, and access to manufactured goods that indicated rising living standards throughout Scandinavian populations. Urban development during this period was particularly impressive. Cities like Trondheim, Bergen, and Stockholm became major commercial centres that attracted merchants from across northern Europe. Archaeological excavations reveal sophisticated infrastructure that supported populations much larger than traditional Scandinavian settlements had ever accommodated. But the prosperity and sophistication also created internal tensions that challenged traditional Scandinavian values. Archaeological evidence shows increasing social stratification that differed from earlier, more egalitarian patterns. Royal courts became elaborate institutions that separated rulers from ordinary citizens in ways that conflicted with traditional Scandinavian concepts of accessible leadership. Archaeological excavations at royal sites reveal ceremonial requirements and luxury standards that exceeded anything previous Viking societies had experienced. The religious transformation was particularly challenging for communities that had maintained traditional practices for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows gradual rather than sudden change, but the process created cultural tensions that affected all aspects of Scandinavian society. Traditional religious sites were abandoned or converted to Christian use. Archaeological excavations reveal churches built directly over pagan temples, symbolizing the replacement of old beliefs with new ones. But the conversion wasn't always complete. Many sites show evidence of continued traditional practices alongside official Christian observance. The cultural tensions were most visible in artistic production. Archaeological finds from this period show remarkable creativity, as artists struggled to express Christian themes using traditional Scandinavian techniques. The results were often spectacular, but they also revealed the difficulty of combining different cultural traditions without losing the distinctive characteristics of either. The period's artistic achievements were extraordinary by any standard. Metalwork that combined Scandinavian craftsmanship with influences from across Europe and beyond. Textile production that created fabrics rivaling anything manufactured in Constantinople or Baghdad. Stone carving that adapted traditional Scandinavian themes to Christian architectural requirements. Archaeological evidence shows that artistic innovation was occurring at all social levels, not just in royal courts. Ordinary households possessed decorated objects that demonstrated sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. Local craftsmen were creating original works that influenced artistic development across Northern Europe. But the artistic flowering also revealed growing cultural complexity that made traditional Scandinavian identity increasingly difficult to define. Archaeological finds show artifacts that combined so many different influences that determining their cultural origin requires detailed technical analysis. By 1000, Scandinavian civilization had achieved something unprecedented in medieval European history. Societies that had started as relatively simple farming and trading communities had evolved into sophisticated kingdoms that could compete with any contemporary power in military effectiveness, administrative capability, and cultural achievement. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia shows urban centres that rivaled Paris and Constantinople, legal systems that were more advanced than most European arrangements, artistic and literary traditions that influenced cultural development far beyond Scandinavian borders. The transformation was remarkable by any measure. The descendants of farmers who had first sailed to Lindisfarne were now ruling kingdoms that influenced European politics at the highest levels. They had created governmental systems, legal traditions, and cultural institutions that would endure for centuries. But success also created challenges that threatened the very characteristics that had made Scandinavian expansion possible. Royal obligations conflicted with traditional freedoms. Christian conversion challenged cultural practices that had defined Scandinavian identity. Administrative requirements reduced the mobility and independence that had enabled Viking achievements. Archaeological evidence from the early 11th century shows declining emphasis on traditional Viking activities. Fewer ships built for exploration and raiding, more resources devoted to territorial administration and European diplomatic obligations. The period that had begun with Harald Bluetooth's ambitious vision of Scandinavian empire was ending with kingdoms that were undeniably successful, but fundamentally different from the societies that had created them. The Vikings had achieved everything they had set out to accomplish, but in doing so they had transformed themselves into something that was no longer quite Viking. The Silver Age was ending. The question now was whether the sophisticated European kingdoms that Scandinavian rulers had created could preserve the cultural characteristics that had made their success possible, or whether achievement would ultimately mean the end of the distinctive civilization that had produced it. The answer would come soon. Political pressures were building that would test whether Scandinavian kingdoms could maintain their independence and cultural identity in a European system that demanded conformity to Christian feudal standards. The greatest challenges still lay ahead. The sophisticated kingdoms that Harald Bluetooth and Olaf Tryggvason had created were facing new challenges by 1050. The medieval world was changing in ways that made traditional Viking advantages less meaningful. European societies had learned to defend themselves against seaborne assault. Christian kingdoms were demanding religious conformity that conflicted with Scandinavian independence. Most troubling of all, the very success of Viking integration was making continued expansion unnecessary and increasingly difficult. The career of one man showed both the heights that Viking civilization had reached and the forces that would soon end it. Harald Hardrada began his adult life as a member of the last generation that could still live as traditional Vikings. Born around 1015, he grew up hearing stories about the great expeditions to America and Russia. But by the time he was old enough to seek his own adventures, most of the easily accessible opportunities had already been claimed by earlier generations. Harald's solution was to push exploration further than anyone had attempted before. At age 15, he joined his half-brother Olaf Haraldsson's army in the campaign that would make Olaf king of Norway. When that campaign failed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, Harald found himself in exile with no obvious path to power in Scandinavia. Traditional Viking response to such setbacks was to organise raiding expeditions that could generate enough wealth and reputation to fund a return to power. But European defences had evolved significantly since the early days of unprotected monasteries and defenceless trading towns. Instead, Harald chose the eastern route that Swedish Vikings had pioneered. He travelled to Kiev, then to Constantinople, where he joined the Varangian Guard as a professional soldier in Byzantine service. Harald's career in Constantinople showed how completely the eastern expansion had transformed Viking opportunities. The Varangian Guard wasn't a temporary military assignment. It was a pathway to advancement within the most sophisticated governmental system in medieval Europe. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that Varangian Guards weren't just soldiers. They were diplomats, administrators, and technical specialists who carried Byzantine knowledge and practices back to Scandinavian societies. Harald learned Greek, studied imperial administrative methods, and observed military technologies that were centuries ahead of anything available in Northern Europe. Harald spent 15 years in Byzantine service, participating in campaigns across the Mediterranean and into the Middle East. He fought against Arab forces in Sicily, participated in the conquest of Bulgaria, and served in the imperial expeditions that attempted to reconquer southern Italy. But Harald's experiences also revealed how limited Viking opportunities were becoming. The Byzantine Empire was wealthy and powerful, but it was also rigidly hierarchical in ways that conflicted with Scandinavian concepts of individual advancement. Even the most successful Varangian Guards remained foreign mercenaries rather than full participants in imperial society. Archaeological evidence suggests that Harald accumulated enormous wealth during his Byzantine service. Contemporary sources describe treasure that required several ships to transport. But wealth alone wasn't sufficient for achieving the kind of independent power that earlier Viking leaders had gained through successful raiding. When Harald returned to Scandinavia around 1045, he found a world that had changed dramatically during his absence. The kingdoms that earlier Viking leaders had established were now facing pressure from emerging European nation-states that operated according to different political principles. Norway had been conquered by Magnus the Good, who ruled both Norway and Denmark in personal union. This represented a fundamental shift in Scandinavian politics. Instead of independent kingdoms competing for territory and resources, Scandinavian rulers were consolidating power to resist external pressure from larger European powers. Harald's path to power required displacing Magnus, which meant civil war within Norway rather than external expansion. This represented a crucial change in Viking political dynamics. The energy that had previously been directed toward conquest and exploration was now focused on internal competition for control of existing territories. Archaeological evidence from this period shows declining investment in the kind of military technology that had made Viking expansion possible. Fewer longships were being built for ocean voyaging. More resources were devoted to fortifications and siege equipment designed for territorial warfare rather than mobile raiding. When Magnus died unexpectedly in 1047, Harald became king of Norway through negotiation and political maneuvering rather than military conquest. But the kingdom he inherited faced challenges that no previous Viking ruler had encountered. European military technology was evolving in ways that reduced traditional Scandinavian advantages. Crossbows could penetrate the mail armor that had protected Viking warriors. Fortification techniques were making surprise attacks much more difficult. Most significantly, European armies were adopting cavalry tactics that could counter Viking infantry formations. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavian military equipment was adapting to these changes. Heavier armour appears in Norwegian graves from this period. Weapons designed for fighting mounted opponents. Siege equipment that suggests defensive rather than offensive strategic thinking. But the technological changes were less significant than political transformations that were making traditional Viking expansion impossible. The loose collection of competing kingdoms that had made medieval Europe vulnerable to Viking attacks was being replaced by centralized nation-states with professional armies and coordinated defensive strategies. England under Edward the Confessor was developing governmental systems that could respond quickly to external threats. France was emerging as a unified kingdom under royal authority that extended across most of modern French territory. The Holy Roman Empire was asserting control over territories that had previously been accessible to Viking penetration. Religious changes were equally significant. The Christianization of Scandinavia was nearing completion by 1050. Archaeological evidence shows churches replacing traditional religious sites throughout Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. This wasn't just spiritual transformation, it was political integration with European Christian civilization that limited Scandinavian independence. Christian conversion brought advantages: diplomatic relationships with papal and imperial courts, access to European commercial networks, cultural legitimacy that eased political negotiations, but it also brought obligations that conflicted with traditional Viking freedoms. Archaeological evidence from Harald's reign shows increasing emphasis on European-style royal ceremonial. Churches built according to continental architectural standards, court customs that matched those of other European monarchs, legal systems that incorporated canon law alongside traditional Scandinavian assemblies. The economic foundations of Viking society were also changing in ways that made traditional expansion less attractive. The silver that had flowed into Scandinavia through raiding and tribute was being replaced by profits from legitimate trade and agricultural production. Archaeological evidence shows remarkable prosperity throughout Scandinavian society during this period, but the wealth came from internal development rather than external conquest. Mining operations that extracted iron and other metals for export, agricultural innovations that increased crop yields, manufacturing that produced goods for European markets. This economic transformation created different social pressures than raiding culture had generated. Successful farmers and merchants gained influence at the expense of traditional warrior elites. Archaeological evidence shows increasing social stratification based on commercial success rather than military achievement. Harald's response to these challenges showed both the adaptability and the limitations of late Viking leadership. He understood that traditional expansion opportunities were disappearing, but he also believed that one more great expedition might restore Norwegian power and prestige. Harald's target was England. This wasn't random selection. England represented the greatest Viking success story. Danish and Norwegian rulers had conquered and governed English territories for over 2 centuries. Harold claimed authority over England through complex inheritance arguments that connected him to earlier Scandinavian rulers. But Harold's invasion plans revealed how completely the strategic situation had changed since the Great Army's successes 2 centuries earlier. England in 1066 was a unified kingdom under Harold Godwinson's authority. Professional armies protected all major ports. Fortification networks could coordinate resistance across the entire kingdom. Archaeological evidence from this period shows that English defensive preparations were specifically designed to counter Viking invasion techniques. Harbour defences that could prevent surprise landings, communication systems that could summon reinforcements quickly, military equipment adapted for fighting Scandinavian forces. Harold's invasion preparations showed similar awareness of changed circumstances. His army included Norwegian troops, but also mercenaries from across northern Europe. His fleet carried siege equipment for attacking fortified positions. His planning assumed extended campaigning rather than quick strikes. But the preparations also revealed internal weaknesses that hadn't existed during the Great Expansion period. Harold had to negotiate with Norwegian nobles for military support. He needed to coordinate with Tostig Godwinson, Harold's rebellious brother, who offered assistance in exchange for territorial concessions. These diplomatic requirements reduced the mobility and surprise that had made earlier Viking campaigns successful. Archaeological evidence suggests that Harold's invasion force was smaller than contemporary accounts claimed. Perhaps 8,000 warriors rather than the much larger numbers reported by English chroniclers. This represented a significant reduction from the armies that earlier Viking leaders had assembled for major campaigns. More significantly, Harold's forces lacked the unity of purpose that had characterized successful Viking expeditions. Archaeological evidence shows equipment from multiple regions, suggesting coalitions of convenience rather than coherent military organizations. The invasion itself began promisingly. Harold's forces landed in northern England and defeated English armies at Fulford Gate, but the victory revealed how much Viking tactical thinking had stagnated while English military capabilities had improved. Archaeological evidence from the Fulford battlefield shows that Harold's forces used traditional Viking formations against English troops equipped with newer weapons and armour. The victory came through superior numbers and individual fighting skill rather than tactical innovation. But Harold's success at Fulford also demonstrated the strategic limitations that would doom his campaign. Viking armies were still capable of winning individual battles, but they couldn't sustain extended campaigns against unified kingdoms with professional military establishments. The English response to Harold's invasion showed how completely European defensive capabilities had evolved. Instead of waiting behind fortifications for the Vikings to withdraw, Harold Godwinson assembled a national army and marched north to confront the invaders directly. Archaeological evidence suggests that Harold's army included troops from across England, not just the northern regions where Harold had landed. This represented coordination capabilities that no European ruler had possessed during the early Viking period. The confrontation that would end Harold's career and symbolically conclude the Viking Age was approaching rapidly. But even before the final battle, it was clear that the medieval world had changed too much for traditional Viking expansion to continue. European kingdoms were too well defended. Christian obligations limited Scandinavian independence. Economic prosperity reduced the desperation that had driven earlier generations toward unknown horizons. Most significantly, the very success of Viking integration had made continued expansion unnecessary for achieving wealth and status. Archaeological evidence from across Scandinavia shows societies that were prosperous, sophisticated, and increasingly European in their cultural orientation. The descendants of farmers who had first sailed to Lindisfarne were now ruling kingdoms that rivaled any contemporary power in wealth and governmental capability. But success had also transformed them into something that was no longer quite Viking. The mobility, independence, and adventurous spirit that had made Scandinavian expansion possible were being replaced by royal obligations and territorial responsibilities that kept rulers close to home. Harald Hardrada represented the last generation of Viking leaders who remembered what the age of expansion had been like. His invasion of England would be the final attempt to recapture the glory and opportunity that earlier generations had taken for granted. The long sunset was ending. The question now was whether it would conclude with a brilliant final flash of traditional Viking achievement, or with the recognition that the age of Scandinavian adventure had simply run its course. The answer would come at a place called Stamford Bridge, where the last great Viking king would face the reality that medieval Europe had learned to defend itself against the descendants of the warriors who had once seemed unstoppable. The confrontation that would end the Viking Age began on a crisp September morning in 1066. Harald Hardrada's army was resting at Stamford Bridge, 7 miles east of York. They had just received tribute from the city and were waiting for additional English hostages to be delivered. The Norwegian king felt confident about his position. His victory at Fulford Gate had demonstrated that Viking warriors could still defeat English armies in open battle. Local English nobles were negotiating for peace rather than continuing resistance. Everything suggested that the conquest of northern England was proceeding according to plan. Archaeological evidence from the Stamford Bridge site shows that Harold's forces had settled into a defensive position that controlled the bridge crossing over the River Derwent. This wasn't just a temporary camp. It was a strategic stronghold designed to dominate the region's transportation network. But Harold had made a crucial miscalculation. He expected King Harold Godwinson to remain in southern England, defending against the Norman invasion that everyone knew was coming. Instead, Harold had assembled a national army and was marching north at unprecedented speed. The English king's decision to confront the Norwegian invasion immediately showed how much royal authority had evolved since the early Viking period. Harold could mobilize troops from across England and coordinate their movement over hundreds of miles in just a few weeks. This kind of administrative capability hadn't existed when earlier Viking forces had conquered Anglo-Saxon kingdoms piecemeal. Archaeological evidence suggests that Harold's army covered nearly 200 miles in less than a week. This required logistics coordination that demonstrated sophisticated governmental systems, supply arrangements for thousands of troops, communication networks that could coordinate movement across multiple regions, military organization that could integrate forces from different areas into a coherent fighting force. When the English army appeared on the hills overlooking Stamford Bridge on September the 25th, Harold's forces were completely surprised. Many Norwegian warriors had left their armour at their ships, assuming no immediate threat existed. The warm September weather had encouraged relaxed discipline that would prove fatal. The English offer of terms showed how completely the diplomatic situation had changed since traditional Viking negotiations. Harold Godwinson offered Tostig, his rebellious brother who was fighting alongside Harold, forgiveness and restoration of his earldom. But he offered Harald Hardrada only 7 feet of English ground, or more since he is taller than most men. This wasn't just royal defiance, it was formal rejection of the inheritance claims that Harold had used to justify his invasion. The English king was asserting that Scandinavian rulers had no legitimate authority over English territory, regardless of historical precedents. Harold's response revealed both the strengths and limitations of traditional Viking leadership. He refused to consider retreat or negotiation. His reputation required decisive military action that would either confirm his authority or end his career. This kind of personal courage had made individual Viking leaders successful for 3 centuries, but it was poorly suited to the political complexities of 11th century European warfare. The Battle of Stamford Bridge began with a tactical situation that favoured the Norwegian forces. They controlled the bridge crossing and could force the English army to attack across a narrow front, where superior numbers provided less advantage. Archaeological analysis of the battlefield suggests that the initial Norwegian position was nearly impregnable. The bridge was narrow enough that individual warriors could hold it against much larger forces. The terrain beyond the crossing favoured defensive formations that could maximise the effectiveness of traditional Viking weapons and tactics. But the battle also demonstrated how English military capabilities had evolved to counter Viking advantages. Instead of frontal assault across the bridge, Harald's forces used coordinated manoeuvres that isolated Norwegian defenders and prevented effective mutual support. Contemporary accounts describe English tactics that showed sophisticated understanding of Viking fighting methods, feigned retreats that drew Norwegian warriors out of defensive positions, coordinated attacks from multiple directions that prevented traditional shield wall formations, use of cavalry and archers in ways that exploited weaknesses in Viking equipment and training. The death of Harald Hardrada marked more than just Norwegian defeat. It symbolized the end of an entire approach to medieval warfare and politics that had dominated northern Europe for 3 centuries. Archaeological evidence from Harald's burial suggests that he was killed by an arrow rather than in hand-to-hand combat. This detail is significant because it shows how battlefield technology was making traditional Viking warrior culture obsolete. Individual heroism and sword skill couldn't overcome missile weapons that could kill from a distance. The Norwegian army's collapse after Harald's death revealed another crucial change in medieval military organization. Earlier, Viking forces had often continued fighting effectively, even after losing their leaders. But Harald's army was a royal expedition dependent on royal authority, rather than a traditional warrior band bound by personal loyalty. Archaeological evidence suggests that most Norwegian survivors fled immediately toward their ships, rather than attempting to continue the campaign. This represented a fundamental shift from the desperate courage that had characterized earlier Viking warfare, but the most significant aspect of Stamford Bridge was its timing. Just 3 days after Harald's death, William the Conqueror landed in southern England with a Norman invasion force. Harold Godwinson's army had to march south immediately to confront this new threat, giving them no time to rest or celebrate their victory over the Norwegians. The connection between these events wasn't coincidental. William's invasion represented the culmination of political and military developments that had been building throughout the 11th century. The Norman conquest would complete the transformation of medieval European warfare that had been making traditional Viking methods obsolete. Archaeological evidence shows that William's army used military technologies and tactical methods that were generations ahead of anything Harold's Norwegians had employed. Heavy cavalry that could break infantry formations, crossbows that could penetrate the finest armor, siege equipment that could reduce any fortification. More significantly, William's invasion was supported by papal blessing and feudal obligations that gave it legitimacy according to contemporary European standards. This wasn't foreign conquest like traditional Viking raids. It was dynastic succession that operated within accepted legal and religious frameworks. The Battle of Hastings on October 14th demonstrated how completely medieval warfare had evolved beyond Viking capabilities. Harold Godwinson's army, exhausted from the march south and depleted by casualties from Stamford Bridge, was still able to maintain defensive positions that held off Norman attacks for most of the day, but Norman tactical flexibility and technological superiority eventually proved decisive. Archaeological analysis of the Hastings battlefield shows evidence of coordinated cavalry charges, archer volleys, and feigned retreats that systematically wore down English resistance. Harold's death at Hastings ended Anglo-Saxon royal independence and brought England under Norman control. But it also completed the political transformation that had been making traditional Viking expansion impossible. Archaeological evidence from both battlefields shows the decisive importance of technological and organizational changes that had occurred during the late Viking period. European armies were using equipment, tactics, and coordination methods that no traditional Viking force could match. The irony of 1066 was profound. The Viking Age ended when a descendant of Vikings conquered England by defeating both an Anglo-Saxon king and the last great Viking king within 3 weeks. William the Conqueror's success represented the triumph of evolved Scandinavian political methods over traditional Viking military approaches. Archaeological analysis of Norman equipment and tactics shows clear influences from 3 centuries of Viking innovation. Superior naval technology for crossing the English Channel, administrative systems that could coordinate complex military campaigns, political concepts that legitimized conquest through legal and religious justification. But the Norman approach also showed how Viking methods had been adapted to European feudal systems that operated according to completely different principles. William's invasion was sanctioned by papal authority and feudal obligations rather than personal ambition and warrior courage. The transformation was complete. The desperate farmers who had first crossed the North Sea to raid Lindisfarne had evolved into European royalty who conquered kingdoms using sophisticated military and political systems that bore little resemblance to traditional Viking methods. Archaeological evidence from across northern Europe shows that 1066 marked a clear transition point in medieval warfare and politics. Traditional Viking equipment and tactics virtually disappear from the archaeological record after this date. Royal administration becomes increasingly standardized according to European feudal models. The Battle of Stamford Bridge represented the last time that a traditional Viking army attempted major conquest, using methods that had been successful for 3 centuries. Harold's defeat demonstrated that those methods were no longer viable against evolved European defences, but the defeat also represented something more profound. The end of the restless, adventurous spirit that had driven Scandinavian expansion across the medieval world. Future Scandinavian rulers would be European monarchs governing established territories rather than Viking chieftains seeking new horizons. Archaeological evidence from late 11th century Scandinavia shows societies that were prosperous and sophisticated, but fundamentally different from the cultures that had produced the Great Age of exploration and conquest. Urban centres focused on administration rather than expedition planning. Military resources devoted to territorial defence rather than offensive campaigns. The Viking Age didn't end because Scandinavian societies failed. It ended because they succeeded so completely that they no longer needed the desperate courage and restless energy that had made their expansion possible. The descendants of Harald Hardrada would be European kings ruling according to Christian feudal principles. They would govern territories that were larger and richer than anything their Viking ancestors had controlled. But they would no longer be Vikings in any meaningful sense. The long sunset was over. The age that had begun with Brother Higbald's bell at Lindisfarne ended with Harold's death at Stamford Bridge. 3 centuries of Scandinavian adventure, conquest and discovery had transformed the medieval world and created the foundations for modern European civilization. But the transformation had also consumed the culture that created it. The Vikings had achieved everything they had set out to accomplish. In doing so, they had evolved into something entirely different from what they had been. The final storm had passed. What remained was the task of understanding what the Vikings had achieved and how their legacy would influence the world they had helped to create. The death of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge ended the Viking Age as a historical period. But it didn't end Viking influence on the medieval world. 3 centuries of Scandinavian expansion had created changes that would shape European civilization for generations to come. The most obvious legacy was political. Viking conquest and settlement had fundamentally altered the governmental systems of every region they had touched. These changes survived long after traditional Viking culture had disappeared. In England, the Danelaw had introduced Scandinavian legal concepts that became permanent features of English law. Archaeological evidence shows that Danish administrative methods continued to influence English governance centuries after the Norman conquest. The concept of individual rights that Vikings brought to England eventually contributed to developments like Magna Carta and the English Parliament. The linguistic impact was even more profound. Modern English contains thousands of words borrowed from Old Norse during the Viking period. These weren't just technical terms or exotic vocabulary. They were basic words that English speakers use every day without realizing their Scandinavian origin. Common pronouns like they, them, and their replaced Anglo-Saxon equivalents during the Danelaw period. Basic verbs like take, get, and give came from Old Norse. Even fundamental concepts like husband, wife, and home entered English through Viking settlement. Archaeological evidence from English towns shows how thoroughly Danish and Norwegian settlers integrated with Anglo-Saxon populations. Burial practices that combined both traditions, pottery styles that mixed Scandinavian and English techniques, housing designs that adapted Viking construction methods to English environmental conditions. This cultural mixing created something entirely new. Neither purely Scandinavian nor purely Anglo-Saxon, but a hybrid society that combined the best elements of both traditions. The results influenced English cultural development in ways that extended far beyond the medieval period. Archaeological excavations in York, Lincoln, and other major Danelaw cities reveal sophisticated urban planning that served as models for medieval town development across northern Europe. Street layouts that maximized commercial efficiency, harbour facilities that could accommodate the largest ships of the period, market systems that balanced merchant interest with consumer protection. The Norman conquest brought additional Scandinavian influence to England through William the Conqueror's Viking ancestry. Norman administrative methods, military technology, and architectural styles all showed clear influences from 3 centuries of Viking innovation. Archaeological evidence from Norman buildings in England reveals construction techniques that originated in Scandinavian shipbuilding, timber framing methods that created stronger, more flexible structures, architectural proportions that reflected Viking aesthetic sensibilities, engineering solutions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of materials and environmental conditions. But the Viking legacy extended far beyond England. In Ireland, Scandinavian settlers had created the first true cities in Irish history. Dublin, Cork, and Waterford were all Viking foundations that became permanent centres of Irish political and economic development. Archaeological excavations in Dublin reveal sophisticated urban infrastructure that didn't exist anywhere else in early medieval Ireland. Harbour facilities that could accommodate international shipping, manufacturing districts that produced goods for export across northern Europe, administrative centres that coordinated commercial activities across the Irish Sea region. The Irish legal system also incorporated Scandinavian concepts that survived long after Viking political control ended. Archaeological evidence shows that Irish law codes adopted Viking principles of individual rights and assembly governance that influenced Irish political development for centuries. Scotland showed similar patterns. The Hebrides, Orkney and Shetland remained under Scandinavian control for centuries after Viking expansion elsewhere had ended. These territories developed unique cultures that combined Scottish, Scandinavian, and Celtic elements in ways that created entirely new traditions. Archaeological evidence from Scottish Viking sites shows remarkable cultural synthesis. Churches built using Scandinavian construction techniques, but designed for Celtic Christian worship. Legal assemblies that combined Viking democratic traditions with Scottish clan systems. Artistic production that merged different cultural traditions into distinctive regional styles. The Eastern expansion had even more profound long-term consequences. The Swedish Viking presence in Russia had created the political foundations for what would eventually become the Russian Empire. The names Russia and Ukraine both derive from Scandinavian terms, reflecting the lasting influence of Viking political organization. Archaeological evidence from Novgorod and Kiev shows that Swedish administrative methods influenced Eastern European governmental development for centuries. Legal systems that balanced royal authority with local assemblies. Trade networks that connected the Arctic Ocean to the Black Sea. Urban planning that created some of medieval Europe's most prosperous cities. The Varangian Guard had introduced Scandinavian military methods to Byzantine armies and carried Byzantine knowledge back to northern Europe. This cultural exchange influenced military development across the medieval world in ways that extended far beyond Scandinavian territories. Archaeological evidence shows that former Varangian Guards became influential leaders in Swedish and Norwegian communities, bringing administrative techniques and technological innovations that transformed Scandinavian society. The connections they maintained with Constantinople influenced Northern European art, architecture, and religious practices for generations. But perhaps the most significant Viking legacy was conceptual rather than institutional. 3 centuries of Scandinavian expansion had introduced ideas about individual freedom, democratic governance, and cultural adaptability that would influence European development for centuries. The Viking emphasis on personal courage and individual achievement challenged medieval European assumptions about social hierarchy and predetermined destiny. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking societies maintained social mobility and merit-based advancement long after most European cultures had adopted rigid class systems. The democratic assemblies that Vikings established in their settlements introduced concepts of representative governance and legal equality that wouldn't become widespread in Europe until much later periods. These ideas survived in remote areas like Iceland and the Faroe Islands, where they influenced the eventual development of modern democratic institutions. Archaeological excavations at Thing sites across the former Viking world show sophisticated understanding of procedural fairness and individual rights that was centuries ahead of contemporary European legal thinking. These concepts gradually spread to neighbouring regions and contributed to the eventual development of constitutional government. The Viking approach to cultural adaptation also introduced revolutionary ideas about identity and belonging. Unlike most medieval European cultures, which define themselves in opposition to foreign influences, Viking societies actively incorporated useful elements from other traditions. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking communities routinely adopted foreign technologies, religious practices, and cultural customs that proved beneficial. This openness to innovation created more dynamic societies that could adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. The results were visible across the Viking world: Scandinavian settlements that successfully integrated with local populations while maintaining their distinctive characteristics. Trade networks that connected previously isolated regions and facilitated cultural exchange on unprecedented scales. Political systems that balanced different cultural traditions in ways that benefited everyone involved. These achievements introduced concepts of multiculturalism and cultural synthesis that wouldn't become widespread in European thinking until much later periods. The Viking example demonstrated that different peoples could coexist productively without losing their distinctive identities. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows remarkable cultural diversity within unified political systems, churches and temples serving different religious communities, legal systems that accommodated different cultural traditions, economic arrangements that benefited participants from multiple ethnic backgrounds. The maritime technologies that Vikings developed also had lasting influence on European development. Shipbuilding techniques that originated in Scandinavian yards eventually spread throughout northern Europe and influenced the age of exploration. Archaeological analysis of medieval ships shows clear Viking influences in hull design, rigging systems, and navigation equipment. The flexible construction methods that made longships so effective in rough weather became standard features of European shipbuilding for centuries. Navigation techniques that Vikings developed for ocean crossing also influenced later maritime exploration. The use of natural phenomena for direction finding, the understanding of ocean currents and weather patterns, and the development of specialized navigation instruments all contributed to the eventual European discovery and exploration of the world's oceans. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking navigation knowledge was preserved and transmitted through maritime communities long after the end of the Viking Age. Icelandic sailors maintained Atlantic navigation skills that influenced later expeditions to North America. Norwegian seafaring traditions contributed to Arctic exploration during later centuries, but perhaps the most enduring Viking legacy was psychological rather than technological. 3 centuries of successful expansion had demonstrated that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things through courage, skill, and determination. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows societies that valued individual initiative and collective achievement in ways that challenged medieval European assumptions about human potential. The Viking example suggested that social boundaries could be crossed, that new territories could be settled, and that established powers could be challenged successfully. These ideas influenced European thinking in ways that extended far beyond Scandinavian territories. The concept that ambitious individuals could reshape their circumstances through bold action became a fundamental element of European cultural identity. The Viking legacy was also preserved through literature and historical memory. The Icelandic sagas, written during the medieval period, provided detailed accounts of Viking achievements that influenced European literature for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that saga traditions were maintained throughout Scandinavia and in Viking settlements across the medieval world. These stories preserved not just historical information, but cultural values and ideals that continued to influence Northern European societies long after political conditions had changed completely. The sagas also introduced literary techniques and narrative approaches that influenced European storytelling traditions. Complex character development, realistic dialogue, and detailed historical settings became standard elements of Northern European literature. But the most significant aspect of Viking literary legacy was its democratic character. Unlike most medieval literature, which focused on royal courts and religious themes, the sagas celebrated individual achievement and personal courage, regardless of social background. Archaeological evidence shows that saga traditions were maintained at all social levels, not just among elite audiences. Ordinary farmers and craftsmen preserved stories about their ancestors' achievements and passed them down through generations of oral tradition before they were written down. This democratic approach to historical memory influenced European cultural development in ways that challenged traditional assumptions about whose stories were worth preserving and celebrating. By 1200, the political structures that Vikings had created were being absorbed into larger European systems. But the cultural influences they had introduced continued to shape medieval European development in ways that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration. Archaeological evidence from across the former Viking world shows societies that maintained Scandinavian cultural characteristics while adapting to changing political and religious circumstances. Legal traditions that preserved Viking concepts of individual rights, economic systems that reflected Scandinavian commercial innovations, social structures that maintained Viking ideals of personal achievement and democratic participation. The Vikings had created more than just kingdoms and trade networks. They had introduced ideas about human potential and cultural possibility that would influence European civilization for centuries. The farmers who had first sailed from Scandinavia to raid Lindisfarne had accidentally launched changes that would eventually reshape the entire world. The eternal Northmen lived on not in their descendants' political power, but in the cultural DNA they had planted throughout medieval Europe. Their legacy was written in the languages people spoke, the laws that governed their societies, and the dreams that drove them toward distant horizons. Walk through any major city today, and you're surrounded by Viking influence, even if you don't realize it. The street names in York and Dublin, the democratic assemblies in Iceland and the Faroe Islands, the English words you speak without thinking about their Scandinavian origins, the restless spirit that drives modern exploration and innovation. The Vikings didn't just disappear after 1066. They became part of the foundation that everything else was built on. Language tells the clearest story. When you say husband or wife, you're using words that came from Old Norse speakers who settled in medieval England. When you talk about taking something or getting an idea, you're using Viking verbs that replaced Anglo-Saxon equivalents during the Danelaw period. The pronouns they, them, and their came from Scandinavian settlers who needed ways to talk about people and things in their new English-speaking communities. These aren't just borrowings from a foreign language. They're evidence of cultural mixing so complete that it changed how English speakers think about basic concepts. Archaeological evidence shows that this linguistic influence extended far beyond vocabulary. Viking settlement patterns influenced how English communities organized themselves physically and socially. Village layouts that reflected Scandinavian preferences. Agricultural techniques that combined both traditions. Legal systems that balanced individual rights with community responsibilities. Modern English legal traditions still carry Viking DNA. The concept of trial by jury has roots in Scandinavian assembly practices. The idea that individuals have rights that governments must respect traces back to Viking democratic traditions. Even the word law itself comes from Old Norse, reflecting how thoroughly Scandinavian legal concepts influenced English development. Parliamentary democracy owes crucial debts to Viking political innovations. The Icelandic Althing, established in 930, represents one of the world's oldest continuous democratic institutions. Archaeological excavations at Thingvellir show sophisticated understanding of representative governance and procedural fairness that was centuries ahead of most European political thinking. These democratic traditions survived in remote Scandinavian communities and gradually influenced European political development during later centuries. The concepts of individual rights, representative assemblies, and legal equality that Vikings pioneered eventually contributed to modern constitutional government. But the Viking legacy extends far beyond Europe. The exploration techniques they developed for crossing unknown oceans influenced later European maritime expeditions. Navigation methods that Leif Erikson used to reach North America contributed to the knowledge base that Christopher Columbus drew upon 5 centuries later. Archaeological analysis shows that Viking navigation instruments and techniques were preserved and refined by maritime communities throughout the medieval period. The understanding of ocean currents, weather patterns, and celestial navigation that Scandinavian explorers developed became part of the accumulated knowledge that made later global exploration possible. The shipbuilding innovations that made Viking expansion possible also influenced the development of vessels used during the Age of Exploration. Hull designs that originated in Scandinavian yards appeared in modified form on ships that carried Europeans around the world during the 15th and 16th centuries. Modern urban planning shows clear influences from Viking city-building techniques. The grid street patterns that Vikings developed in Dublin and York became models for medieval town planning across northern Europe. Harbour facilities that Scandinavian settlers built influenced port development for centuries. Archaeological evidence from Viking trading centres shows sophisticated understanding of commercial organisation and market regulation that influenced European economic development. Standards for weights and measures, quality control for manufactured goods, and international trading relationships that Vikings established became foundations for later commercial systems. The banking and credit systems that modern economies depend on have roots in Viking commercial innovations. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavian merchants developed techniques for transferring wealth across vast distances and managing commercial relationships between cultures with different legal and monetary systems. These financial innovations were necessary for maintaining trade networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. The solutions that Viking merchants developed influenced European commercial practices for centuries and contributed to the eventual development of international banking and credit systems. But perhaps the most significant Viking legacy is psychological rather than institutional. The spirit of adventure and exploration that drove Scandinavian expansion has become a fundamental element of modern Western culture. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking societies valued individual initiative and personal achievement in ways that challenged medieval assumptions about social hierarchy and predetermined destiny. These attitudes influenced European cultural development and eventually contributed to the individualistic outlook that characterizes modern democratic societies. The Viking emphasis on exploration and discovery also influenced European approaches to science and technology. The willingness to venture into unknown territories and experiment with new techniques became part of the cultural foundation for the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Modern entrepreneurial culture shows clear Viking influences. The combination of calculated risk-taking, innovative thinking, and persistent determination that characterized successful Viking expeditions appears throughout contemporary business and technology development. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows societies that encouraged innovation and rewarded successful adaptation to new circumstances. These cultural values survived in northern European communities and gradually influenced broader European attitudes toward change and progress. The environmental adaptability that Vikings demonstrated in places like Greenland and Iceland also contributed to modern understanding of sustainable development and climate adaptation. Archaeological analysis of Viking farming and resource management techniques provides insights that are relevant to contemporary environmental challenges. Viking approaches to cultural diversity and integration also influence modern concepts of multiculturalism. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavian communities successfully incorporated foreign technologies, religious practices, and cultural customs while maintaining their distinctive identities. This openness to beneficial foreign influences created more dynamic societies that could adapt rapidly to changing circumstances. The example demonstrated that different cultures could coexist productively without losing their distinctive characteristics. Modern democratic societies that successfully integrate diverse populations owe conceptual debts to Viking innovations in cultural synthesis and political inclusion. The techniques that Scandinavian settlers used to create unified communities from diverse ethnic and cultural backgrounds provided early examples of successful multicultural governance. The literary legacy of the Vikings continues to influence contemporary culture through the preservation of saga traditions. These medieval Icelandic texts provided detailed accounts of Viking achievements that have influenced European literature for centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that saga traditions preserved not just historical information, but cultural values and ideals that continue to influence Northern European societies. Stories about individual courage, personal achievement, and successful adaptation to challenging circumstances remain powerful cultural influences. Contemporary popular culture shows continuing fascination with Viking themes and values. Movies, television shows, and literature that draw inspiration from Scandinavian expansion reflect ongoing interest in the adventure, courage, and independence that characterized Viking society. But the most enduring Viking influence may be the demonstration that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things through courage, skill, and determination. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements shows societies that valued personal initiative and collective achievement in ways that challenged medieval assumptions about human potential. The Viking example suggested that social boundaries could be crossed, that new territories could be settled, and that established powers could be challenged successfully. These ideas became fundamental elements of European cultural identity and eventually influenced global attitudes toward individual achievement and social progress. Modern space exploration shows clear conceptual connections to Viking maritime exploration. The willingness to venture into unknown territories using cutting-edge technology reflects the same spirit that drove Leif Erikson to cross the Atlantic Ocean using medieval navigation techniques. Archaeological analysis of Viking exploration equipment and techniques reveals problem-solving approaches and risk management strategies that remain relevant to contemporary exploration challenges. The combination of careful planning, technological innovation, and personal courage that characterize successful Viking expeditions appears throughout modern scientific and exploratory endeavors. The Vikings also left behind a powerful example of how small, determined communities can influence the development of entire civilizations. Archaeological evidence shows that Scandinavian populations were never large compared to the territories they explored and the cultures they influenced, but their impact was disproportionate to their numbers because they brought innovations in technology, governance, and cultural organization that proved beneficial to everyone they encountered. The lesson remains relevant for understanding how innovation and cultural change occur in any historical period. The farmers who first sailed from Scandinavia to raid Lindisfarne couldn't have imagined that their desperate search for survival would eventually influence languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people, legal systems that govern entire continents, and cultural values that shape global civilization. But archaeological evidence shows that Viking achievements created exactly that kind of lasting influence. The changes they introduced to medieval European society became foundations for developments that eventually reshaped the entire world. Every time someone exercises democratic rights, explores unknown territories, or builds something new from a combination of different cultural traditions, they're following patterns that the Vikings established over 1,000 years ago. The age of longships and sea raids is long over, but the spirit that drove those first desperate farmers to cross unknown waters in search of new opportunities continues to influence how people think about possibility, achievement, and the courage required to create something better than what currently exists. That may be the Vikings' greatest legacy. Not the kingdoms they founded or the cities they built, but the demonstration that ordinary people with sufficient determination can cross any ocean, overcome any obstacle, and create changes that influence the world for centuries to come. The eternal Northmen live on in everyone who looks beyond the horizon and wonders what might be possible on the other side.